Hello, dear viewers. Support me by subscribing to my channel and share my video if you like it. And also, make sure you comment your thoughts. Now let's start the video.
She knew something was wrong the moment she heard the trumpets. She just burst into Rhaenys' chamber when the first cries entered the fringes of her hearing. By the time she'd managed to sprint to her son's nursery, cradling the infant under one arm and hoisting her toddler on the other hip, the cries were as loud her own heartbeat. The Dornish princess nearly screamed when the door to the nursery crashed inward, instinctively shielding her children from whoever had burst into the chamber. A being filled the doorway, broader than the width between doorposts, a huge hand resting on the sword at his hip. Her knees almost gave out when that someone turned out to be Manfred Dark, her lady-in-waiting Ashara Dane slipping around the boulder of a man and rushing into the nursery, her violet eyes panicked. Sir Manfred's eyes were not, the night as unflappable even in this clear emergency as he was in day-to-day life. "Princess," came his gruff voice, "we need to go. Now." Elia needn't be told twice, and she gratefully handed the whimpering Rhaenys to Ashara before pulling Aegon, sleeping and blissfully unaware of what was going on around him, closer to her chest. Sir Manfred turned and Elia followed instantly, Ashara close behind her. Men-at-arms rushed through the corridors, shoving each other and shouting as they sprinted down the halls of the Red Keep. Sir Manfred strode confidently through them like a battering ram, sending one man-at-arms to the ground with a quick shove when the lad didn't get out of the way in time. Elia and Ashara huddled closely to his broad back, the noise of clanking armor and the sense of spreading panic waking Aegon, who began to cry. Elia hushed her son even though she knew it would do no good. She didn't know who was currently raising hell on the city of King's Landing, but it didn't really matter if they were attacking. They either wanted Elia and her children as hostages or wanted them dead. The Dornish princess wasn't overly fond of either idea. Elia had had no idea where Sir Manfred was going, but where he came to a halt would have been one of her last guesses. Her bodyguard slammed his palm 3 times on the door of Lord Varys' chambers, and the spider opened it instantly. The bald, portly eunuch wordlessly ushered them in. Princess Elia, as confused as she could ever remember being, followed Sir Manfred in only when he waved his hand impatiently. The spider's chambers were barren, with only a bed, table and a few chairs as decoration. But it wasn't what wasn't in his chambers that surprised Elia even in this moment of panic and unknowing, it was what was. Queen Rhaela Targaryen stood in the center of the room, one hand placed protectively over her swelling stomach, the other clutching the hand of the 6-year-old Prince Viserys. Elia's uncle, aging Prince Lewin Mardell of the Kingsguard, stood beside them in his resplendent white enamel plate, his own hand resting on the sword at his hip. "Elia," the youngest Targaryen called, his young face scared. He started towards the Dornish woman, but the queen held his hand firmly. While Elia and Rhaela got along fairly well in their limited exposure to the other, the queen clearly didn't want to release her young son's hand when she didn't know what she was doing here or what was going on. Elia didn't blame her. She pulled the crying Aegon even closer to her chest. The spider spared no words, merely walking in that strange stroll of his and making a quick motion with his hands at the wall. And then that wall moved, neatly floating up to reveal a staircase, and Elia decided that nothing made sense anymore. Up the staircase came the fluttering voice of Varys. "My little birds will direct you from there." Sir Manfred nodded, turning to give them only a few gruff words. "Follow me, your graces." The knight turned and without ceremony stomped up the stairs, his hand on his sword, the passel of royalty following. Prince Lewin, giving his niece a confident smile, took the rear. Aegon's cries resonated in the narrow, musky passage, and Viserys repeatedly asked what was going on despite his mother hushing him each time. Rhaenys took to crying as well, Ashara trying and failing to calm the child. Elia knew Sir Manfred and her uncle had to be gritting their teeth, escorting 3 women and 3 crying children down an old passage that lead to who the hell knew, but the squat knight and elderly Kingsguard said nothing, focused solely on the dark passage ahead. At the top of the stairs was their escort. When Varys had referred to his little birds, he literally meant little. Their guide was a child, no more than 10. The passage they were in was dark, only a few torches spaced generous distances apart offering light, but Elia recognized the youngster as a regular around the servant quarters, the daughter of the blacksmith or some other castle-bound small folk. If this child is for Varys, who else is as well? The thought was disconcerting to say the least, but since the spider seemed to be her children's best way to escape, she wasn't going to give it all that much thought. Priorities. They made more twists and turns than Elia could keep track of, climbing then descending then going straight, the blacksmith's daughter handing them off to another child the Princess of Dorne didn't recognize before that child in turn handed them off to another and then another. Aaliyah was thankful for them all, because without them she would be as lost as a septon in a brothel. Aaliyah didn't know how much time they spent in the darkness, her children crying, Viserys growing more and more stressed, and Sir Manfred charging stubbornly on, before the smooth stone below her feet suddenly turned rough, and the next thing Aaliyah knew she was being blinded by sunlight. "We need to move," called the voice of a short, slender man with a rather ordinary face. A boat with black sails, one so small she had trouble believing Sir Manfred wouldn't sink it with his weight alone, was grounded on a narrow strip of beach behind him, surrounded by the rock of the cliffs on all sides. The smell and sound of the narrow sea was overpowered by the smell of smoke and the cries from the city on the cliffs above them. Sir Manfred stomped to the boat, turning to the royal family and ushering them on. "Quickly, your graces." They filed in one at a time, huddling close to one another. Aegon's insistent cries grating with Aaliyah's already frayed nerves. "I know you're scared, my love, but I can't protect you if I'm deaf. For the love of the gods, shush." That prayer went unanswered as Aegon's cries only grew louder and more frequent. Prince Lewin assisted the pregnant Queen Rhaella aboard with great care. "Careful now, your grace," Aaliyah's uncle said, smiling as he always did. "I'm already disobeying the king's orders by being here. I can't have you hurting yourself and giving him even more reason to kill me." "Do not worry, Sir Lewin," said the queen. Her tone was quiet, but it had more strength to it than Aaliyah had heard in years. "If I were to die, the king would probably reward you." Viserys doggedly stayed on the beach even after his mother was settled, eyeing the man with the boat distrustfully. "Who is he, mother? He smells like a fish." "Hush, child," came the voice of the queen, growing firm. "This man is saving us. Get on board." The young prince scowled. "Father wouldn't like this." "Your father isn't here, love. Get on the boat." Viserys dug his heels into the sand. "We are blood of the dragon, we don't go with peasants." Aaliyah was beginning to fear Viserys may hold them much too long. She had known nothing of the secret passages of the keep, and it seemed the queen hadn't either, so it was unlikely someone would follow them, but the sooner they were on the sea the better she would feel. That was an odd fact considering she had no idea who the small man waiting nervously by the prow of the boat was. Panic made for the strangest friends she supposed. Aaliyah began to rise with the intent of manhandling the youngest Targaryen prince onto the boat, wanting more than anything to be gone from the wretched sounds coming from the city. Sir Manfred beat her to it. "Your mother says go, you little shit," the big knight growled, his irritation as plain in his voice as it was on his ugly face. "You're going." Sir Manfred moved astonishingly fast for a man of his stature, and Viserys couldn't churn his young legs quick enough. Her sworn sword grabbed the prince, one hand clutching an arm and the other a leg, and jumped on board, the youngest son of Aerys shouting the whole way. Sir Manfred paid him no mind, depositing the boy next to his mother who, despite her fierce protectiveness of Viserys, had not moved to protest the knight's actions. The big man kept one hand pressed down on the prince's tiny shoulder, keeping him firmly attached to his seat. "Be off," the knight barked, and the small man obliged, heaving the boat into the water with a strength that surprised the Princess of Dorne. Once it was sufficiently water-bound, the nimble man jumped aboard, taking one oar while Sir Manfred took the other, handing the duty of containing the still struggling Viserys to the Knight of the Kingsguard. "The wind is in our favor," the brown-haired savior said, Aelor recognizing his accent as that of a man from King's Landing. "Once we row far enough out, we'll go full sail." "Thank you," the Dornish princess said, her heart feeling more and more relieved the farther away from the cliffs of King's Landing they rode. She pulled Aegon closer, his cries no longer the nuisance they had been mere moments before, and reached to pull Rhaenys to her side. "We can never repay you, sir. Davos, my lady," the man said, giving her a quick grin through his salt and pepper beard. "And I'm no sir. Aelor Targaryen was going to die." He'd managed to dodge out of the way of the monstrous assassin's initial blow, the wind from the blade cutting through the air brushing against his cheek like a gale. Aelor barely had time to even step back, bringing his sword and shield up, before the giant was bringing his blade down overhead like an axe, intent on splitting the Targaryen's skull. Aelor jumped to the left, the giant's blade digging into the smoothed stone of the nursery's floor, and swung his own sword at the big man's unprotected side. How the giant was quick enough to bring his massive sword up in time to block him, the dragon prince would never know, the beast's blade knocking the prince's aside and his opposite fist, the size of a small castle, grazing the point of Aelor's chin. The dragon of Duskendale staggered back, ears ringing and vision reduced to stars. Only the unbalanced manner in which the giant had landed the blow, paired with the fact that it hadn't connected fully, saved every bone in the prince's face from being broken. If the assassin had managed to land the hit clean, Aelor had no doubt it would have shattered every bone it touched, and most likely would have killed him then and there. It was then it became clear to Aelor that he could not beat this thing. It was oddly peaceful, accepting one's death. The giant roared. A guttural sound so frighteningly unhuman that Aelor wondered if this, not warrior and himself, was what the embodiment of the stranger looked like. He swung again, Aelor seeing through the stars just enough to manage to dodge aside. The prince never even had time to go on the offensive, the stupidly long blade of his killer already whistling in towards his side, Aelor bringing his shield up instinctively. Aelor was no small man himself, tall and broad-shouldered, but he might as well have been the size of one of the many dolls he had gifted Rhaenys. When the mountain of a man's blade hit the shield, it barely even stopped the swing's momentum. Aelor Targaryen went flying, armor and all, like a stone from a catapult, slamming into the wall of the nursery with a clank of steel plate on stone before hitting the ground in a heap. Aelor suddenly realized how much everything hurt. His face hurt, the blood still flowing from his wound and his chin throbbing. His right arm hurt, fatigued from the strength it exerted to both swing and drive through enemy armor. His left arm hurt now too, from fingertip to elbow, his shield nearly sheared in two, the top half hanging onto the bottom only by a few slivers of wood and bent steel. Hell, his whole body hurt from head to toe. He felt more than heard the massive footfalls of the giant assassin coming to end his life. Aelor couldn't find it in himself to care. No amount of the bloodlust or battle rage he had felt only minutes before was present. And even if it was, it couldn't have helped him. All he felt was pain. Hell, he didn't even know where his sword was. Well, shit. Knights are supposed to die with their swords in their hand. Aelor supposed that didn't really matter. No one was going to sing a story about him, the dragon who had his ass handed to him by a man with dogs on his surcoat. God's dogs, why couldn't his sigil be a tiger or a direwolf, something fearsome? Aelor recognized his thoughts as the ramblings of a disconcerted, dying man. That was all well and good because that was exactly what he was. The mountain of a man stopped in front of the heaped pile of a prince, raising his sword the size of Westeros and aiming it at the dragon's head with a smile. Aelor met his eyes, willing himself even in his stupor to meet his death head-on. And then a sword burst out of the mountainous assassin's neck, angled upwards. The giant dropped his own blade, the greatsword clattering to the ground at Aelor's feet, while its one wielder clawed at the blade that had cut his throat. With a sickening slosh, the blade was withdrawn, only to reappear a moment later slicing through the flesh at the back of the giant's legs, sending the beast to his knees. Aelor still didn't know who was behind the saving blade, for the monster before him was tall even when cut down to half his normal size. The first hack dug into the side of the dog's neck, cutting flesh and tendon, but the giant animal still struggled, pulling a dirk from his belt and reaching for Aelor even as he choked on his own blood. The second hack dug deeper, the third even more so, slowing the giant hand reaching to end the Lord of Duskendale's life. It took several more, Aelor watching in grim astonishment as the mountainous man fought on despite a wound that would have killed most long ago, before a final swipe severed the animal's head, sending it bouncing across the nursery floor like a child's ball. The body of the assassin protested death for a moment longer, its hand still trying to grasp the battered prince before them, before it finally toppled like a falling elm to the bloody stone. Aelor stared at the corpse for a long moment, mind still hazy, face still throbbing, before he finally looked up at the soul that had saved him. When the face registered through his addled brain, Aelor knew he had to be dreaming. There in the nursery, sword bloody and black armor shining, stood Rhaegar Targaryen, a sad smile on his face. The sack of King's Landing had to have been one of the most perplexing battles in the history of Westeros. Aelor had been there, and even he was confused. 12,000 Westermen had descended onto the light-defended capital, gaining the gates through deception. The door to the city had no sooner been opened than the true intent of the lions became clear, the guards being cut down before the mass pillaging of the City of Dragons began. Women were raped, innocents slaughtered. Gold and other valuables taken. Half of Flea Bottom had gone up in flames, the cries of hundreds of small folk filling the gray sky as they burned in the filthy slum they called home. And then another force had arrived, bearing the warring white dragons of Prince Aelor, smashing into the disorganized Westermen with the force of a blacksmith's hammer. The massacre had turned from that of civilians to soldiers, many being caught literally with their pants around their ankles, pulled off of the women they were raping and disemboweled, their lifeblood flowing around their stiffened members to form great crimson puddles. Many of the Westermen were so committed to the utter chaos they were racking that they never knew they were being attacked before it was too late. Infantry under Lord Randall Tarley of the Westmark had followed, many rushing through the gates to assist the cavalry of Prince Aelor in ridding the capital of lions, while others formed there, cutting down any Lannister who tried to flee. Some Western lords managed to rally retainers and attempt breakouts at each of the gates, but the men of the Reach, unbloodied so far in the war, held firm, keeping the lions in their cage. What rattled most about the battle wasn't the quick changes in momentum, however. What rattled most was the presence of two Targaryen princes. Aelor, Lord of Duskendale and second son of the king, had rode through the mud gate first, in the minds of the citizens cutting bloody swaths alongside Barristan the Bold and his best knights on their way to the Red Keep, through sheer brilliance anticipating Lord Tywin's move and arriving to thwart the Lion. Rhaegar, Lord of Dragonstone and heir to the throne, had ridden through the King's Gate alone, cutting his own path through the carnage towards the same destination. To many he had appeared as a god, returning from his self-imposed exile in time to save the city of his birth with his brother. Only the two men in question knew what utter gibberish all of it was. The brothers sat in silence in the small council chamber, one at each end of the table. Rhaegar, hauntingly beautiful face framed by long silver hair, was strumming his lute, changing the song periodically. Aelor, his face bruised and bloodied, held a chalice of wine in his right hand and a tankard to refill it in his left. Neither spoke for a long time. "Do I have to call you your grace now?" the latter finally asked, the cut he received from Tyget Lannister bound to make for one hell of a scar. His elder brother smiled sadly. "Rhaegar does everything sadly. Only in public, in private you are still my brother." Aelor nodded sharply. "Good, because king or not I'm still going to curse you for a fool." Rhaegar Targaryen, the first of his name, king of the Andals, the Rhoynar and the First Men, lord of the Seven Kingdoms and protector of the realm, smiled all the sadder. "I know. Their father was dead. They had found the Mad King dead at the feet of Jaime Lannister. His long fingernails snapped from his impact with the ground, a bloody smile carved into his throat. Jaime sat the throne, dressed in the golden armor of his house instead of the white enamel plate of the Kingsguard, looking as calm as if he'd only swatted a fly instead of killing the king he was sworn to protect. The lad hadn't put up a fight, dropping his sword and submitting himself to chains in the black cells, when Sir Barristan and Alaric had found him after finding and killing the fat armory lorch in Rhaenys chambers. Aelor didn't feel so much as a hint of sadness at the death of his father, a fact that no longer bothered him. His heart was so black by now it would have surprised him if he was to actually feel remorse. Sir Barristan Selmy stood guard at the door of the chamber, the only Kingsguard left in the city besides the new Kingslayer. As Rhaegar's three companions hadn't returned with him, Prince Lewin Mardell was with the new heir to the throne, and Sir Jon Arthur Darry had been found slain in the chambers of Princess Aelia, having gone to check on the princess, and instead running into a giant as he crushed a lady-in-waiting's head. Darry was an excellent swordsman, but he didn't stand a chance against the behemoth they'd learned had been called Gregor Clegane. They'd found his body nearly cut in two at the waist, lying over the ruin of what had once been Talana Vaith, the lady-in-waiting looking as if she'd been ravaged by a monster. That same monster had very nearly killed Aelor, only stopped from succeeding by the new king. Clegane's head now resided on a spike on the battlements of the Red Keep. Rhaegar cleared his throat, and for a moment Aelor thought he was going to begin to sing, but instead the new king of the Iron Throne spoke. "Pity. I always liked my brother's singing. Maybe it would have calmed me down enough to not want to kill him. Where are my children?" Aelor took another drink of wine. He wasn't overly fond of alcohol, but right now he needed plenty of it. Halfway to Dragonstone by now if the winds were good. Rhaegar waited for an explanation Aelor didn't voluntarily give. "How?" "The same way I knew Tywin Lannister was marching, with the help of a spider." Rhaegar tilted his head back in understanding. "Lord Varys." Aelor nodded. "You know of the secret passages. You and I used to ditch our lessons and play in them as boys. The spider knows them better than anyone. I left my man Manfred Dark and recruited Varys' help should the city be attacked. He did the rest. Odds are they were well gone by the time I arrived, though in my panic I'd entirely forgotten the plan myself. I'll have to apologize to the Swordfish Knight for my crude language." "Baratheon." Aelor clenched his jaw, teeth grinding. "I had the choice of riding for King's Landing or destroying the rebellion's leader. I could not do both." Rhaegar nodded. "I understand." They sat in silence for a few moments longer, Rhaegar strumming the lute absently. "Our father is dead. If I were to sue for peace, do you believe?" "No," Aelor cut him off. "Why the hell would they? They have an army already amassed and reinforcements with a claimant marching towards them. And you and I are still alive. We are as guilty of starting this war as our father was." Rhaegar raised an eyebrow. "Oh, yes," Aelor said, voice growing hard as his anger rose. "You ran off with a woman who wasn't your wife." Rhaegar sighed. "Brother, save it," Aelor cut in, rising in his wrath. "You stole a woman, disrespecting your beautiful wife who will make the best queen since Alysanne Targaryen, and then you brought the girl's father and brother to King's Landing where our father killed them. Thanks to you, Rhaegar." Aelor glared at his brother a moment before dropping back into his seat in a defeated slouch, taking a long sip of wine. And I am no better. Rhaegar watched his brother calmly. How so? Aelor stared into his wine. We've always known what our father was since we were little boys. For a long time we didn't stop him because we couldn't, but what excuse do we have for the last few years? We were his sons, you were loved by all the realm, and they at least didn't hate me. We could have done something, stopped all of this. Instead you steal a woman and I watch as a good man is burned alive, his son killing himself in a desperate attempt to save his father. Aelor's stare was unseeing, the prince reliving a dark night full of wildfire and burnt flesh. I stood and watched. I could have done something, stopped the madness before it began, but I did nothing. And then I ran. I ran so I wouldn't have to listen as he raped our mother, the sweetest woman the gods ever graced Westeros with. Aelor took another long drink before laughing bitterly. Some princes we are. Rhaegar said nothing, instead starting to strum the Dornishman's wife on his lute. The king played and the prince drank, neither speaking for a long while. I suppose I owe you for saving my life, Aelor said eventually, his tone making no secret of how distasteful he found that fact to be. No, Rhaegar responded, still playing. You ensured Aaliyah and my children were smuggled to safety. That is a debt I cannot repay. Good, Aelor said, slamming his chalice down, because you're the most foolish son of a bitch I have ever known. Rhaegar sighed again. I know you don't understand, Aelor. You're damn right. The prophecy, piss on your prophecy, Aelor spat, voice cold and sharp as he rose to his feet again. That whole ridiculous delusion that you let become your obsession has already killed thousands. You broke a good woman's heart and ran out on 2 wonderful children because you buggering dreamed it was for the best. Horse shit it was. You tore a realm apart because of the decades-old ramblings of a woods witch. The prince that was promised, sure as hell isn't you or I. Rhaegar clenched his jaw, only now beginning to grow angry at his younger brother's berating. Careful, brother, Aelor snorted. Or what, your grace? Are you going to burn me alive as our father would have done? I've been fighting a war for you, Rhaegar. I've been doing it poorly at times, I admit, but at least I was trying to put a stop to the destruction of our dynasty. And what were you doing? Hiding hell knows where with a woman who for all I know you kidnapped, letting men die by the scores. Aelor had both his hands on the table as he leaned over it, violet eyes boring into his brother's identical ones. To Rhaegar's credit, he met them evenly. Maybe Aegon is the prince that was promised, but he can only fulfill your prophecy if we steer him to greatness, and we can only do that if we are alive. In case you weren't aware, there are tens of thousands of men at Riverrun and thousands more heading there, all aimed at killing every Targaryen that breathes. Rhaegar was silent even longer, now playing the bear and the maiden fair. Aelor wanted to take the lute and break it over his brother's head. Are we certain they are still at Riverrun? Aelor sat slowly as he nodded, some of his anger dissipating after he lost his temper. I'm still going to kill him, but I suppose I can wait until the war is over to do it. No, Baratheon is marching that way and he has too far of a lead on Prince Oberyn and his Dornishmen. Whether the rest of the rebellion is still at Riverrun or marching to meet Baratheon we're unsure of. How many men do they have? Close to 40,000. We'll have close to the same once Oberyn arrives, probably 5,000 or so less. I sent Mace Tyrell and the Red Wine fleet to besiege Storm's End. Rhaegar cocked his brow. I imagine Robert's brothers are there, but does it truly matter whether Storm's End falls? Aelor shook his head. No, but it keeps Tyrell out of the way. Rhaegar smiled, and for the first time that day it wasn't a sad one. Prudent of you, Aelor, you have made quite a name for yourself in this war. The Dragon of Duskendale shrugged. The 7 know why. I've only fought a handful of battles, and each of them I've either had the element of surprise or superior numbers. And I still had my flank turned by Selwyn buggering Tarth. A dragon outmaneuvered by a man with the nickname Evenstar. How pathetic. Your men love you, and I dare say you're being thought of as the second coming of Aemon the Dragon Knight. I'm good at killing people, so is every sellsword on either side of the narrow sea. But none of those sellswords are princes of the Iron Throne or Hand of the King. Aelor stared at Rhaegar a long moment. You're going to need to clarify that. Rhaegar put his lute aside, standing to walk to his brother's chair. Father's last Hand of the King was apparently some pyromancer, Rosart I believe. Jaime Lannister killed him before he cut our father's throat. Why? Rhaegar shrugged. I couldn't say, though I fully intend to find out. I need a Hand of the King, one who can help me finish this war and also rule the 7 kingdoms in Aegon's name should something happen to me. I can think of no one better than you. The king held his hand out to his shocked brother. Aelor hit him. Rhaegar went reeling backwards, though he kept his feet. No, he told Sir Barristan when the Kingsguard Knight began to start for them, intent on breaking them up. Let him rage, so Aelor raged. Though 3 years younger, Aelor had been bigger and stronger than Rhaegar for most of their lives, and he used it. His chair went flying back as the Dragon of Duskendale burst out of it, landing another blow to his brother, the king's cheekbone. Rhaegar fought back, though they both knew he was outmatched. It was as if they were young children again, settling their quarrels through the world's oldest method of negotiation. Sir Barristan the Bold, grateful for being called off, could only watch with a slight smile on his face as the two Targaryens beat the hell out of each other like they were children again. Barristan would know. He'd watched them many times before. By the time they were done, Aelor's cut had reopened, fresh blood flowing down the second son's jaw. Rhaegar's hauntingly beautiful face was no longer quite as beautiful, his lip busted and bruises already beginning to form. Both men were breathing heavily, Aelor hunched over with his hands on his knees and Rhaegar hugging a column to keep himself standing. "If you think," Aelor started through gasps for breath, "that a damn pin is going to make me forget your stupidity." "I know it won't," Rhaegar replied, holding that column closer than he ever had his wife. "But it's a serious offer. We have a war to win, you're the best man for it." Aelor glared daggers at his brother while both caught their breath. After several long minutes he slowly rose, face still angry and fists, bloody knuckles and all, still clenched. "I'll take the damn pin until the war is over. Then you'll take it back and find someone else to run your kingdoms for you, because I sure as hell won't." Rhaegar had gone from hugging the column to simply leaning against it. "Fair enough, though if I die I want you to be Aegon's regent. You'll care for him, Rhaenys and Aelia, probably better than I ever could." "I already do." Rhaegar's sad smile returned. Aelor found it easier to stomach when Rhaegar winced at his split lip. "I know," he held his brother's gaze, "you love her." Aelor raised a brow. "Rhaenys, of course. Aelia." Aelor's face instantly turned shocked. "You have for years." "Baby brother, you might not have known it, but I have. And she loves you, though I doubt she knows it either." Aelor began to viciously protest, but it died in his throat. He thought of Aelia then, all Dornish beauty with a heart of gold. He had always been fond of her, it was true, but he had never considered it something more. She was his brother's wife, an unattainable object that Aelor hadn't even realized he wanted. But then he remembered that he did have a strange fondness for Dornish women that had begun roughly when Aelia had first arrived in the capital. Anera down at Chadea's was Dornish, as was Senelle at Ali's back in Duskendale. Both were his favorites. And then there was Talana Vaith, so recently deceased. Aelor realized that he thought of Aelia when he was with each of them. Well, I'll be damned. That's buggering messed up, even for a Targaryen. He loved Aelia's company, almost always seeking it out when he had a chance. He wrote her often and thought of her even more. Her laugh never failed to make him smile. "I sound like a young girl, all these romanticized thoughts. Renfred would never let me forget it if he knew." Rhaegar's words made a hell of a lot of sense, Aelor had to admit. So this is love, who knew? Aelor finally looked back at his brother, still leaning against a column. "This changes nothing, Rhaegar, you know us both." "We'd never." "I'm not worried about that, Aelor. Aelia probably doesn't know how she feels anyway. Even if she did, I don't disapprove." Aelor raised an eyebrow in confusion. "You don't care at all that your brother loves your wife?" Rhaegar shrugged, a motion that caused him some pain judging by his wince. "No, nor do I care that my wife loves my brother. All I care for right now is ending this war and keeping my children safe. The rest can be worked out later. I need your help to do so. Are you with me?" Rhaegar held his hand out again. This time Aelor took it. But if you do one more bonehead thing, I promise I'll kill you myself." Rhaegar smiled once more. "I know, brother, believe me, I know." They'd turned Flea Bottom into a funeral pyre. The fire had started during the sack, the exact reason why unclear and unimportant. Randall Tarley had smartly sent teams of men to contain it as best as they could when he saw the smoke billowing, eventually committing most of the loyalist force to the task once the serious fighting had died down. The bodies of the Lannister dead, Lord and Levy alike, were carted to the raging bonfire that had engulfed half the slums from wherever they had died across the city. There were thousands of bodies, and bodies bred disease and illness, so the men were stripped of their armor and weapons and thrown into the fire, the smell of burning flesh engulfing the already stinking city. Several septons, tougher of heart and stomach than most of their brethren, repeated death rites for hours, a communal prayer over a communal end. The armor and swords that could be identified as belonging to lords, Brax, Falwell and Jast, had been recovered already, and more were sure to be found, was set aside to be returned to the dead men's families, per the orders of King Rhaegar Targaryen. The rest, spears of levies, swords and armor of knights and retainers, were sorted and distributed among the loyalist forces, per the orders of Aelor Targaryen, Hand of the King. King's Landing was a massive, sprawling city of thousands. Many Lannister men had used that to their advantage, discarding their weapons and armor for stolen or stripped civilian garb once it was clear the day was lost. There were dozens throughout the city, Aelor knew, but there wasn't anything he could do about it. He was much more concerned with the fortress inside a Fortress Tywin Lannister, and his retainers had made of the great Sept of Baelor. The ruthless lion had realized rather quickly that his men were too disorganized, and focused on pillaging to throw Aelor and his attackers back. Instead, the Lord of Casterly Rock had rallied close to 700 of his men, stripped the street of steel for all the weapons they could carry, and pulled back to the top of Vysnia's hill. He charged the mud gate, being thrown back by infantry under Lord Clayton Byitch, but it was soon discovered that it had been a diversion. Fishmonger's Square, a maze of a market selling everything from wine to animals located just inside the mud gate, had been picked clean of food and drink. The bakeries along the Street of Flour were also barren, the lions using the chaos to carry as many rations as they could to the home of the High Septon. They'd even had the audacity to hoist a roaring lion banner over the sept. The sight of it nearly drove Aelor back into his battle rage. Strong shield. Renfred Ricker greeted his old friend and his squire, clasping forearms with Aelor once he dismounted warrior. The Lord of Hollard Hall had taken an arrow to the shoulder during the attack but had rode on as if it wasn't there. Even now he paid no mind to the bandages wrapped around the wound, face showing not an ounce of discomfort. "You look like hell." "Stronger sword," Aelor responded as Alaric took warrior and his own horse towards the temporary stable. "You look worse." It wasn't true, of course. Aelor's eye was a red gash and he had a knot on his head from where he'd slammed into the wall of Aegon's nursery. However bad he looked, he felt even worse. His body was terribly sore from head to toe and it had taken all he had to dismount warrior. "How's the face feel? It looks like it will make for an impressive scar." "It hurts. How's the arm?" Renfred grinned. "I don't feel a thing." Aelor raised a skeptical eyebrow even as he brushed by Ricker into the abandoned blacksmith shop they were using as a temporary headquarters. "Really? Then why are you favoring it like a child with scrape? I've seen Rhaenys handle injuries better." Aelor stepped into the simple, one-story building that still smelled of steel and the fire of billows even after the Lannisters had cleaned it out. A table of rough wooden planks had been moved in as well as chairs of all different makes. A ramshackle headquarters if ever there was one. Several lords were huddled around it, a map of King's Landing in front of them. Flags, red for Lannister and black for Targaryen, showed the positions of men in the city. There were a few other lion holdouts, one at the Dragon Pit and another on the Street of Silk, but those were minor and being methodically overrun. Tywin was the one that mattered, so it was to Tywin Aelor had gone. Lord Randall Tarly, lean and beginning to bald, had been given command of the city while the Targaryen brothers had gotten reacquainted. He'd restored order quickly and capably, implementing frequent patrols that kept looting to a minimum as well as isolating the Lannister resistance. The man himself stood up straight as Aelor entered, his massive greatsword of Valyrian steel, Heartsbane, sheathed across his back. Tarly's face was grim, his jaw hard set. "Prince Aelor," he said more in acknowledgement than greeting. Hard gray eyes meeting the prince's violet ones and holding them. "Lord Tarly," Aelor nodded in return. "You've done an impressive job. King's Landing hasn't been this orderly in a century." Tarly nodded but said nothing, never one for pleasantries. That was fine with the Dragon of Duskendale. He was sore and tired and wasn't in a mood to be pleasant anyway. "How long can he hold out?" "We're unsure, my lord," said Lord Clayton. "We have no way of knowing how much food and water he managed to steal." "We do know he can't escape," Tarly said, pointing towards the black flags at each gate. "My men aren't letting anyone in or anyone out. The city is locked down." Aelor stroked his beard as he stared at the map. 700, you say? That's plenty enough to put up one hell of a fight were we to storm the Sept, and they have 7 towers to hide in. They have plenty of archers as well, Lord Hand, piped in John Connington, Rhaegar's protege and Lord of Griffin's roost in the Stormlands. Aelor wasn't overly fond of Connington, finding his obsession with Aelor's brother as off-putting as Rhaegar's prophecy, but as a man who was in love with his brother's wife he supposed he didn't have much room to judge. "Our skirmishers have been trading shots with them for hours. We have the numbers to storm it," Prince Aelor, Tarly said. "There will be heavy casualties but they have nowhere to flee to. A few hours bloodshed and it will be over. As will the lives of hundreds of our men." Aelor pointed out, eyes hard. "We're going to need every man we have to fight the rebellion's true strength. We can't leave a hostile force inside our city's gates," Tarly countered. "Of course not. If we have to storm it, we storm it. But the army won't be moving out for several days anyway. We need to rest, resupply and keep the city under control from the aftermath of the attack, as well as affirm Rhaegar as king. We can at least try and think of another way." "But Lord Hand," Connington began, "the traitors don't have the strength to attack King's Landing." Aelor shook his head. "Scouts put Prince Oberyn a mere 2 days away while Baratheon has reunited with Stark and Arryn at Riverrun just 3 days ago. Oberyn will beat them here with days to spare. The Lannisters gained the gates through deception. The rebels have no chance of that. They can't take King's Landing and they won't try." Aelor stretched, trying to work the soreness from his joints. "If I do have to storm a fortress, I don't want to be slow. A Sept would be a hell of a place to die. Give me time, my lords, an opportunity will arise and we will take it." Loren Lannister hated sieges. He'd only been in one for 2 days and he already knew that. 700 men of the Westerlands were holed up in the home of the High Septon, trading arrows with Targaryen loyalists. Tywin was in the midst of a cold rage. The council Loren had just left just a facade for Tywin's rage. No one suggested surrender, though they surely were all thinking it for fear of their life. So they stayed cramped in and around a massive building for the seven on rationed food and wine. Loren didn't really care much about the food, though he loved it as much as any other man. It was the limited wine that was killing him. So it had come to be that the drunken lion stumbled around the darkened corners and rooms of the great sept of Baelor, hands shaking, stomach in knots. Other soldiers avoided or openly mocked him, but Loren paid them no mind. He was in too much suffering to worry over slights. More than one had openly asked Loren how someone like him could have survived to rally to the sept while so many other stronger men had died. It was a fair question. Loren didn't know either. One second he'd been helping himself to the wine stores on the street of, was it sugar, honey, something like that. Another Lannister, one of his numerous cousins of Lannisport, had slit the baker's throat and was in the process of raping the man's daughter. But Loren had been much more invested in helping himself to the wealthy merchant's generous stores of Arbor Gold. Before either was certain what was happening, though, a big knight had burst in barking orders, loading Loren down with the wine he'd been drinking and forcing him to haul it up a hill filled with terrified peasants. A hill. Loren hadn't climbed one of those on foot in years, and he certainly hadn't enjoyed it then. All he wanted was a drink. Well, multiple drinks to be exact. So many drinks that he could pass out and not wake up until this war was long gone and he was back in his branch of the family's mansion back in Lannisport, surrounded by Arbor Gold that he could kill the hangover with. Just how he worked his way into the High Septon's chamber he'd never know. The man himself, called the Tall One or Fat One or something else Loren didn't give two wits about, had been at a minor sept elsewhere in the city when the lions invaded his home and Tywin had commandeered his chambers. Whether the seven would frown on that Loren couldn't say, but he hadn't been familiar with them in a long time anyway. Loren began to turn. Knowing that as much as he didn't want to be in the sept at all, he certainly didn't want to be in a room Tywin Lannister had claimed on his own. When his foot caught on the simple chest the High Septon used to store, well, scriptures or robes or something, Loren didn't really know, and he fell, big belly and all, to the smooth stone floor. He supposed it was particularly bad to curse in a sept, but curse Loren did loudly and repeatedly. Loren lay there, stomach roiling and body shaking, wallowing in his own misery, when he saw the odd level of the floor under the High Septon's modest cot. Part of Loren was opposed to snooping in the avatar of the god's chambers. Another part of Loren was feeling too miserable to care about what he might find. A third part wanted to get out of that chamber as quickly as possible, before a wroth Tywin Lannister came back and decided to unleash his concealed fury on the poor alcoholic sap in his room. And that fourth part, well, that part of Loren was so done with life that he shoved the cot aside. It was a trapdoor, wooden and fit into the stone of the floor with a film of dust on top of it. Loren stared at it for a long time, not even sure he wanted to open the door. What could the High Septon keep under his cot? It turned out to be a tunnel. Loren went down the ladder, breaking through a plethora of spider webs. The tunnel was dark, so dark Loren couldn't make heads or tails of anything. Going back was a clear option and probably the smart thing, but this tunnel had to come out somewhere, and Loren was so desperate for a drink he'd have fought through the seven hells themselves for a full horn of ale. Whatever this tunnel was, he doubted it could be that bad, and he surely wasn't going to get enough to drink in the great sept of Baelor. The drunken lion hugged the wall, breaking through more spider webs and filth than he'd ever been through in his life, tripping and falling to the filthy wood-planked floor more times than he could count. Whoever had built it clearly hadn't used it in a while, but Loren fought on, mainly because he knew he didn't want to be on the other end. I'm going somewhere there is wine, be it in this life or the next. How long he spent in that dark tunnel Loren couldn't say, but when he finally bumped into another ladder, it was all he could do to not shout for joy. The hatch above it required all of his not-so-impressive strength to shove open, as something had been pinned on top of it. But when it finally did break free with a crash, the things that hit his senses were the last thing Loren had expected. While the smells may have left for little doubt, the sounds that were greeting his ears most certainly did not. Loren Lannister was in a whorehouse. It took his eyes a long while to adjust to the light after being in the dark for so long. But Loren finally managed to gather his surroundings as a storeroom. Foods, from sacks of potatoes to sides of dried beef, were neatly ordered in the room alongside. Bless the seven, could it be? Wine, the love of his life, had been what was keeping Loren in the darkness. The drunken lion forgave it instantly, pulling a bottle from a case and uncorking it without so much as looking at the vintage, putting the wine to his lips and letting the alcohol pour down his parched throat. Bliss. Utter and complete bliss. Lauren barely noticed the door to the storeroom open, barely even heard the scream or saw the exposed flesh of the naked Summer Island girl, and almost missed the sharp point of a steel sword that the burly, shirtless man the girl brought back pressed against his stomach. "Tell Waters I found a lion," the gruff voice came, the man throwing his hand out when the girl remained cowering behind his broad back. "Go, girl." The whore ran to obey. Gruff pushing the point hard enough to make Lauren understand that the alcohol, however blessed it made him feel, shouldn't be his main focus right now. While he'd been more than willing to die for just one more bottle mere minutes ago, the refreshing taste of the one he'd just downed gave him a new outlook on life. Pointedly, it made him realize he wanted to keep his. "You've been hiding here this whole time, Lannister scum," the fully bearded man said. His chest covered in so much hair, he looked very much like a bear. "Drinking up the wine to try and avoid what's common to ya." Lauren held his hands up, though he didn't relinquish his grip on the neck of the bottle. "If I'd been here that long, friend, I wouldn't be able to be talking to you right now, much less standing up straight." Gruff snorted in slight amusement, though the press of steel didn't leave his stomach. "Fair point, but if you ain't been in there all this time, just where you been?" Well, that was an interesting question. The truth was that he'd been in a sept, surrounded by men most likely hostile to the one currently pressing a sword to his stomach. Many of them were members of his family, the rest sworn to it, and all of them hadn't liked him. That being said, he was still a Lannister, and that meant he should be loyal to the other Lannisters whether they liked him or not, didn't it? Well, that family had been planning to butcher Targaryen babes. They'd raped many women in the city, and would have more if it weren't for the Targaryen prince arriving when he did. They also had an aversion to giving a drunk the alcohol he needed to function, having pushed Lauren down to a shaking, vomiting husk of the insignificant man he'd been before. But wouldn't telling this gruff bear of a man where that tunnel led, and what his lords could do with that knowledge, make him a traitor? Or did that make him a loyalist? Since the Lannisters were technically rebels to the Iron Throne, it all hurt too much to think of. These people had an abundance of wine, and Gruff was looking at the still open trapdoor anyway, his clearly uneducated but not necessarily stupid mind putting the pieces together slowly. Lauren decided to save him the trouble. "Let me have another bottle of wine," the drunken lion said, "and I'll tell you exactly where I've been." They met in the middle of the tunnel. The shaft was mostly straight, and Aelor Targaryen and the men following him, his best knights, had seen the torches of the Lannisters from a fair distance. Tywin had obviously found the door the OBs, shaking Lannister of Lannisport, had told Aelor about, and was trying to use it as a means to escape. The Dragon of Duskendale was trying to use it as a means of entry. The brothel keeper had been rather off-put when a man was dragged at sword point out of her place of business. Having emerged from the shaft, the elderly Lyseni woman had claimed hadn't been used in 20 years. She'd stopped complaining rather abruptly, however, when a Targaryen prince in full battle plate showed up later. At the head of when the lions rushed forward upon seeing the torches his own men carried, Aelor broke into a sprint of his own towards them. The tunnel was the lions' best chance of escape, as well as the dragon's best chance of access. With both sides wanting to reach the other end, it meant only one thing. The tunnel was soon going to be a river of blood. "Alaric, order the king to attack," Aelor shouted to his squire as he and his warriors rushed forward. "Do it now." The squire reluctantly hugged the wall, jostling by the armored bodies pouring towards the enemy. Aelor eyed the passageway even as he drew his sword. It was only wide enough for two abreast, Aelor on the right and Baum and Bayich on the left. That meant all the men behind them, as well as the men behind the leading Lannisters, wouldn't be able to actively fight, instead pressing the leading men against one another. "Dirks," Bauman cried, "daggers, your grace." Aelor instantly understood. In the close confines of the tunnel, a sword or mace would be too cumbersome to wield, with no room to swing or parry. A dagger, however, would be the perfect weapon to slip between armored joints and other vulnerabilities in the mass of fighting bodies. "Do it," the prince called, his men taking up the call for daggers as the two sides closed in on one another, Aelor sheathing his sword on the run and drawing the emerald-encrusted dagger from his waist. As the two sides closed in on one another, armored bodies charging towards armored bodies all under the flickering light of torches, Aelor couldn't help but wonder if he should have just pulled back. This is no place for a fight. It proved that it surely wasn't. Aelor brought his shield arm up to his neck, lowering his shoulder and using his broad frame as a battering ram. Bauman did the same, and the two men catapulted into the leading Westerlanders, Aelor giving a war cry that his men took up, the Lannisters screaming chants of their own. The blow of his shield hitting the other man's reverberated up his arm, and his warriors pushed against his broad back. The man in front of him, his sigil too obscured in the flickering torchlight for Aelor to even venture a guess at his house, started to falter backwards, Aelor having the advantage of size between the two, but the other lions crashed into their companion's back and shoved him back forwards. It was instantly evident to Aelor that this wasn't a fight. It was a shoving match, armored men piled on armored men, all pushing the man in front of him forward. The men in the middle of the mass of bodies being crushed. As one of those men, Aelor could attest to how uncomfortable it was. But Bauman had had excellent foresight. His opponent had a sword when he couldn't work his arm free enough to use. Aelor had a dagger, and though his movement was also severely restricted between the friends piled against his back and the enemies shoving against his shield, he could just manage to sink the steel weapon into the gap in the groin of the lion's armor. The man grunted in pain, blood beginning to pour out of the injury as Aelor pulled the dagger out and thrust it back in. The helpless knight began to sink downwards as his lifeblood spilled down his crotch and leg. The forces of men sandwiched him between them, not allowing him to fall at first, but the Lannister behind the dead man soon realized his companion was dead, grabbing his ally with his hands and shoving him down. Aelor helped him, knowing it was far too late to pull his men out. That leaves one direction open to me, forward, and that means you're in my way. They managed to work the dead man's body down enough that the lion behind could step up on it, using his sudden height and attempting to strike down at the prince in front of him. The close quarters did him in as well, the Lannister man unable to use his sword except as a puncturing weapon, the length of the blade making it unhandy to wield and giving Aelor time to bend his body out of the way. Aelor avoided the sword the knight was using as a glorified knife and drove his own dagger under the man's armpit. Blood ran in rivulets down the dragon prince's black armor, covering him, but the lion died quickly. The man behind Aelor, seeing what his prince needed done and being strong enough to do it, reached over his liege's head and grabbed the dead lion, hauling him armor and all over Aelor's helm, and giving the prince time to step over the body of the first man he killed, and lock up with the third Lannister before that man could use his sword. This one, burly and with a plain helm, was smart enough to see the prince's advantage, catching the Targaryen's arm with his shield and slamming it against the tunnel's side, pinning the dagger in it out of the fight. Aelor's shield collided with the man's chest, but the mass of bodies pressing against his back hadn't allowed him to put any power behind the blow. Their helms were thrust dangerously close together, the steel encasing the Westerlander's face muffling his voice. "Targaryen cunt," the Westlander spat out. Aelor was trying to come up with a clever reply when the man rammed his helm into the faceplate of the prince's. "Damn it," the prince cursed, the gash across his eye screaming in protest and the coppery taste of blood filling his mouth. "Well, bugger you too then." Aelor returned the favor, ramming his own helm into the other man's. Even then, the soreness from the knot Gregor Clegane had raised on his head flared up in pain. Ouch, nobody wins with the headbutt. The knight behind Aelor once again came to his prince's support, apparently managing to have disposed of the second dead Lannister's body. Slipping his arms around the prince, he grasped the lion's shield, pulling with enough strength to free Aelor's dagger. The prince buried it into the insulting man's neck, still unable to come up with a proper insult. Damn. I suppose he got the last word. The shoving match continued for some time, Aelor nearly finding himself dead when he worked ahead of Bauman. At least he assumed Bauman was still the man helping lead the charge, and a Lannister man was suddenly stabbing his sword at the prince's side. He was only saved by another Lannister knight, this one knocking the first sword aside in his rush for glory, trying to be the man to slay the dragon of Duskendale. Aelor managed to turn in time for him, killing the second by cutting his throat and watching the other die at the hands of the knight who seemed to always have his back. It was only then that Aelor realized the man was Renfred Ricker. The tunnel had filled with corpses and blood by the time the Lannisters started to pull back, the crammed quarters of battle suddenly loosening and loosening, until Aelor could finally stand without touching another living being. He gave pursuit, finally able to use his sword after sheathing his bloody dagger, cutting a few of the fleeing men down as he chased them back towards the other end of the tunnel, Renfred unslinging his warhammer and sprinting alongside his prince, moving very quickly for a man of his size. The two lifelong friends charged hard, only stopping their attack when they realized the lions in front of them were surrendering. Aelor soon discovered why when he met his brother a few dozen feet from the ladder leading into the High Septon's chamber. Several of the yielding knights were kneeling between them, swords cast aside. "I see our infiltration didn't work." Aelor greeted his brother as he pulled off his white flame helmet. Alaric, good lad that he was, had managed to scoop it up during the ride to the Red Keep. The langward lad now stood beside the king along with Sir Barristan, both with bloody swords. "Quite the contrary," the king replied as he pulled his own dragonwing helm off his head, long silvery hair a stark contrast to the black of the armor. They were rushing to send men down the tunnel when we came through the front door. Renfrid, big black beard grown bushy while on campaign, had moved like a man without pain during the fight, but now he was beginning to favor his wounded shoulder. Aelor supposed it had reopened as his own gash had. How many men did we lose? More than any of us would have liked, but less than we would have had we stormed it without you acting as a distraction. Tywin, Aelor asked, letting the adrenaline ebb from his bloodstream. I don't see how the man could have escaped, but if this passage is here there is bound to be more. Captured, Rhaegar's melancholy tone confirmed. And still acting as if he is in complete control. Of course he is, he's Tywin Lannister. Aelor cracked his neck, the joint popping in the cramped, smoldering corridor. Do you mind taking this conversation elsewhere? It smells too much like death here. Aye it does, came a new voice, exotic and flowing like a song as the lean owner stepped into view, a smirk on his olive face. Though the blood of Lannisters is a good thing, no. Aelor grinned widely. It seemed the Dornish had arrived. We can't execute him, Prince Oberyn. Rhaegar's voice was tired, both from battle fatigue and from having to reiterate this point over and over again. At least not yet. And why not? Demanded the lean form of Oberyn Martell, the Red Viper of Dorne. His exotic voice was only half as sensuous as the young woman currently seated in his lap. Ellaria Sand he had introduced her as the newest in a long line of Prince Oberyn paramours. While she wasn't beautiful in the conventional sense, she certainly caught the eye. Prince Oberyn seemed especially taken. Aelor knew the Dornishman easily grew bored. Be it with ballads or bed partners, but this one seemed different. The girl was no older than 6 and 10, and despite the Red Viper's less than normal taste, it was unlikely they had been intimately entwined for long. But Oberyn already seemed heavily invested in the bastard of Lord Uller. Invested enough to insist, despite Rhaegar's protests, to bring her into the small council chambers for the War Council. Or maybe that was because of Rhaegar's protests. As angry as Aelor was with Rhaegar's treatment of Aelia, for less than chivalrous reasons, it seemed he held nothing on the rage her brother had for the king. Aelor was going to have to make sure Prince Oberyn didn't kill Rhaegar in his wrath, because we need the army of the Westermen. The king sat at the head of the table, an untouched tankard of ale beside him. Over 3,000 of them are still alive. I need those numbers to counter the traitors. They are traitors, Oberyn argued. They were caught sacking your city, raping your women. They sent an assassin to do the same to my sister and her children. They didn't succeed. No thanks to you, Oberyn spat back, rage evident in both his voice and glare. Ellaria Sand placed a soothing hand on his chest, rubbing small circles as she whispered something in his ear. The razor-sharp tension in the Prince of Dorne's shoulders subsided, though his glare remained. Aelor was suddenly very glad for the paramour's presence. No, it was thanks to me, with the help of Lord Varys. The dragon of Duskendale cut in from the other end of the table, nodding at the spider. And as much as I'd love to slit the throat of every Lannister in our custody, the king is right. Baratheon has 40,000 men, with those Westermen will have close to the same. Numbers do not win wars, said Randyll Tarly, but they certainly help. Oberyn eyed the others at the table, Varys, Tarly, Jon Connington, Sir Barristan and the Targaryens. The Prince of Dorne had ridden into the city during the opening stages of the assault on the Sept, and upon hearing the sounds of battle, had of course had to join in. What are our plans? Varys' tittering voice answered. Baratheon and the others rebellious lords are slowly moving from Riverrun, though it is clear they have no intention of marching on King's Landing. Wise of them, Connington said, nodding. They have no chance of carrying the walls with this many loyalists in the city. They'll wait for us to meet them. Which your grace has to do, Varys said. My little birds tell me there is already talk of Targaryen weakness for allowing the rebels to remain relatively unscathed for so long. Rhaegar nodded. Jon is right, we have to meet them in the field. You won't be able to trust Lannister, Oberyn pointed out, eyes still full of an anger he was managing to keep in check with the help of Ellaria. Maybe that's why he brought her. To help him keep his head during the meeting. That's why we don't bring Tywin, or Jaime. Aelor shared a look with his brother across the table. Rhaegar had gone to the Black Cells to speak with the young Vowbreaker as Aelor had overseen the siege of the Sept, and what the young Lannister had told the king had made Rhaegar Targaryen swear Aelor, Barristan and Alaric Langward to an oath of secrecy about the true reason behind the Mad King's death. Aelor wasn't certain how they were going to handle that situation. For all anyone else knew, Jaime had been injured trying to protect the king and was recovering somewhere in the Red Keep. The truth that Jaime had killed him when Aerys had ordered the city burned made things much more difficult. We'll handle that once this war is won, I suppose, though the Seven know how. Sir Kevan Lannister was captured alongside his brother. Aelor continued on, returning to the subject at hand. He is loyal to his brother, but as such he cares deeply for his safety. If we hold Tywin on threat of death, Kevan will keep the Westerlands in line for the remainder of the war. You can't be seriously considering allowing Tywin to live, Oberyn nearly growled, voice outraged. The man is a dishonorable traitor. Yes, he is, the king said, but he is a Lannister and both respected and feared by his bannermen. We need those numbers for this war. Once it is over we can deal with Tywin as we will with all of the rebellious lords. A name holds powerful sway, Aelor agreed. It's why we have an army at all. It wasn't for love of our father that they remained loyal, of that we are all aware. It is because his name was Targaryen. For that reason Sir Kevin will lead the Westerlanders as we march on the other rebels, because he is a Lannister. Oberyn was clearly not pleased, though he kept his displeasure to himself. He waited a long while before nodding. My men and I are with you. The Prince of Dorne had addressed Aelor, not the king, something Rhaegar had certainly seen. Rhaegar said nothing on it, however, instead rising, prompting the others to do the same, even Oberyn and Illyria. Good, we march on the Riverlands on the morrow. Aelor turned, striding from the chambers to start making the endless preparations necessary to move a host the size of the one in the city. More death and destruction on the horizon, it seems. Aelor didn't dread that thought. That once would have scared him, but it no longer did. I suppose that means I am truly lost. Not that it mattered, he had a war to win. A good man may have trouble doing what was necessary to achieve that, but a man like the one Aelor was turning into would have no problem. No, a man like the one Aelor was turning into would enjoy the process. She was a queen. Word had reached them only a few days after reaching Dragonstone. Prince Aelor's men combined with Reachmen under Randyll Tarly had taken the treacherous Lannister lions in the rear, killing or capturing nearly all of their force. King Aerys had been killed, how it wasn't clear, but dead he was. That made her Aegon, still a squalling babe, the heir to a kingdom. And his father, melancholy betrayer he was, a king who had arrived seemingly when needed most to help save his city. Rhaegar was back. Aelor's brief letter, received only that morning, had barely concealed the second prince's anger at his elder brother, though he did admit Rhaegar had arrived in time to save Aelor from an assassin that had killed Alya's handmaiden and friend Talana Vaith, as well as Sir Jon Arthur Darry of the Kingsguard in brutal, horrific fashion, an assassin that had been meant to do the same to her children. Alya had held Rhaenys and Aegon close for a long while after reading that. Queen Rhaella, Dowager Queen now, it seemed, had taken the news of her husband's death in utter silence, staring over the narrow sea for a long time afterwards. She'd not said a single word, not to Alya or Sir Manfred or Prince Lewin, not to anyone. It had been an unspoken agreement to all involved to say nothing to Viserys, who had settled in well enough on the island of his ancestors, though he avoided Sir Manfred like grayscale. The Dowager Queen would be the best one to handle the eccentric child, and Alya didn't envy her the task. Rhaegar had sent her nothing, not an apology or a poem he so enjoyed writing, not a letter of any kind. Alya supposed Aelor may have something to do with that, his own letter hinting at it clearly, and Alya wasn't sure whether to thank him or berate him for it. While Rhaegar's betrayal, sudden and unexpected, still stung badly enough that the Dornish princess doubted she'd ever forgive her lord husband, she still wanted to hear the reasons why from him. Why he'd done what he'd done and why he'd done it to her. The Stark girl hadn't come with him to King's Landing, nor had the 3 Kingsguard knights that had disappeared with him. Aelor hadn't mentioned her beyond that fact, seemingly pretending that if she wasn't discussed she almost wasn't real. That was utter horseshit. The girl mattered very much, obviously to Rhaegar as a woman he abandoned his marriage for, and to Alya as the woman he left. Had the Stark girl gone with him willingly, Rhaegar didn't seem to Alya as the type to take a woman against her will, and Alya knew him as well or better than anyone else in either Westeros or Essos. But he also hadn't seemed the type to take leave of his senses and sink the kingdom he was to inherit into a civil war. Yet here they were, wrapped up in a conflict that every region of the 7 kingdoms barring the Iron Islands had become embroiled in. Alya had her guesses for the reasoning behind Rhaegar's actions. She knew of the prophecy of the prince that was promised, how a woods which had told her husband's grandfather, the second King Jaehaerys, of how he would be born of the line of Aerys and Rhaella. Rhaegar had confided in her that he had once thought himself to be the prince that was promised, but when a bleeding star had been seen over King's Landing the night they conceived Aegon, he had begun to believe it was their son. While that was all well and good, he had named their son Aegon and their daughter Rhaenys. While Rhaenys had come first, yes, the significance of those names wasn't lost on Alya. If Rhaegar believed her son was the prince that was promised, he probably thought he needed the 2 sister wives his namesake had. He had a Rhaenys and an Aegon. All he needed now was a Visenya. Alya couldn't give him that. She relived the shame of being informed she couldn't fulfill her wifely duty nearly every night. It was a sad thing for a queen to be unable to give her husband heirs. Granted, many would claim she had already done her duty, giving Rhaegar a healthy, growing son, but Alya couldn't help but blame herself for all of this. If she could have only given Rhaegar another daughter, she might have been able to prevent all of this mess they found themselves in now. The idea that her husband would marry Aegon not only to his sister Rhaenys, but also this mythical Vaisnya appalled her, as the Targaryen marriage practice was not well received even in the vastly more open-minded deserts of Dorne, but she would have had years to convince her husband against the idea. But she couldn't give him a Visnaya according to the Meisters, and now here they were. Elia tried to put it all behind her, an impossible task that she must at least strive at if only for her peace of mind. King Rhaegar, first of his name, had sent one piece of parchment, a royal decree. Whatever she thought of her husband and his eccentric decision-making of late, she found the declaration contained to be more than wise. It had the workings of Aelor written all over it, and since the Dragon of Duskendale was the new hand of the king, another wise move in Rhaegar's short reign, Elia was certain he had been adamant in its implementation. Rhaegar had seemed to agree, and the Dornish princess was grateful he had. Sir Manfred was standing guard outside the nursery on Dragonstone, dutiful as ever. The big knight, harsh and uncouth, seemed unaffected by and uncaring for damn near anything. Yet he seemed to care for Rhaenys and Aegon in his own, awkward way, though the Seven knew he wouldn't admit it. Dragonstone was as safe as anywhere, only moderately defended but as an island, obviously accessible only by sea. That required a navy, something the rebellious lords didn't possess. It was because of the relative safety of the secluded, sizzling piece of stone that Aelor had informed her the royal family would be there for the remainder of the war. That sense of safety didn't seem to matter one bit to Sir Manfred Dark, however. He had been even more alert since reaching the Targaryen haven than he had been in King's Landing, no mean feat. "Manfred," Elia called as she approached, her uncle Lewin behind her at her request. "Your Grace," the big man greeted, face a scowl. Elia no longer took that personally, Manfred always scowled. The Dornish princess smiled as she stopped close to the door he guarded. Rhaenys laughed, penetrating the solid oak from the other side where she played with Ashara. "Do you have a family, Sir Manfred? I'm not talking about cousins or uncles or the like, I mean a wife or children." He shook his ugly head. "Do you have the intentions of starting one?" Sir Manfred snorted, "Not buggering likely, I don't have the face, and even if I did I don't have the desire." Elia nodded. "Good. That's excellent. Because from this day forward, that's no longer an option." Sir Manfred's face stared at her unmoving, waiting for her to explain. Does nothing bother him? Elia shook her head at the boulder's uncaring manner, though she continued on. "Sir John Arthur Darry of the Kingsguard died during the battle for King's Landing." Sir Manfred's face twitched, the only sign the Dornish princess had that he knew what was coming next. It was all she needed. Elia smiled warmly at the man who had so competently gotten her family out of the capital. "If you have any objections, now would be the time." Sir Manfred didn't answer verbally, deciding to instead sink to a knee. Prince Lewin stepped forward, drawing his sword and laying it on Manfred's massive shoulder. Elia couldn't contain her glee, beaming as she spoke. "They'll never write stories of his chivalry or demeanor, but he's as worthy as any man I know. In that case, I, Queen Elia of House Mardell, appoint you Sir Manfred of House Dark to the Kingsguard of King Rhaegar Targaryen, the first of his name, King of the Andals, the Rhoynar, and the First Men, Lord of the Seven Kingdoms and Protector of the Realm." I don't know if those are the right words, but I suppose they are close enough. Manfred rose, face once again impassive. "Does this mean I have to stop buggering cursing?" Elia couldn't help but laugh. "No, Sir Manfred. No, it does not." "That's good," came a quiet voice from the other end of the corridor. Rhaela Targaryen stood there, belly round with child, face calm. "Because you're going to want to curse up a maelstrom." "Your Grace," Prince Lewin asked, stepping towards her in concern. The Dowager Queen stared into Elia's eyes. "There are longboats on the horizon. They have 40,000 men and our scouts can't tell us where exactly they buggering are." The march had not been kind to the loyalist forces. Rains, some so savage that Aelor almost believed he was somehow back in the Stormlands, had bogged his army down, the wear of thousands of feet and hooves turning the roads into a muddy mess that nearly swallowed wagons of provisions whole. It seemed like half of his men had come down with either a chill or the shits, sometimes both, and everything was damp. Always so bloody damp. Even here. Camped in the ruins of Harren, the Black's castle where Aelor's ancestors had burned the Iron King and his sons, moisture permeated the air. No matter where he was, outside with the poor levies or here in one of the towers, Aelor couldn't escape the buggering dampness or the residual chill it brought with it. "I'm a Targaryen, we're built for heat and fire, not cold and damnable water." It hadn't done his mood all that many favors either. "Baratheon and his forces keep fighting small skirmishes, my prince," answered the always calm Barristan Selmy. White plate as clean as new fallen snow despite the copious amounts of mud and shit. Just how his mentor managed to keep everything so polished and presentable Aelor would never know. It took the combined efforts of both the Dragon of Duskendale and Alaric to keep his own looking even remotely respectable. A few dozen cavalry here, a quick raid there. He seems content to stay roughly where he is and harass us. It's not a bad idea, Renfred Ricker admitted grudgingly. He can stay relatively in place, leaving all the pains and nuisances of moving an army this size in this weather to take its toll on our own forces. We could always do the same, came the quiet voice of Sir Kevan Lannister. Harrenhal is a ruin, but it's a cavernous one. We can turn it into a stout fortification. The brother to Tywin was overshadowed by his still imprisoned elder brother, but he had proven exceptionally capable at keeping the surviving Westlanders in line. The bad blood between the Lannister men and Aelor's own veterans, men who had been enemies slaughtering the other mere weeks ago, had threatened to boil over early in the march, but the firm reprimands issued by both Sir Kevan and Aelor had stemmed the potential tide of violence. He'd even sent multiple letters to the remaining lords and men in the Westerlands, warning them not to raise the levies Lord Tywin had forsaken in the name of speed. While several lords had wished the king to raise those men to bolster their own forces, Rhaegar and Aelor had both decided to push onwards. They'd left Baratheon and his friends mostly unmolested for much too long, and the time it would take for the West to finish raising men was time they didn't have. No, spoke the even softer voice of the king. Sat at one end of the table, the war council was seated around, the thrum of rain on the ruined castle overhead and all around filling the dusk air. We need to end this war soon before more support for Robert can be found in the Ironborn or some other entity. We must march onwards. Baratheon clearly has a preferred field of battle selected, said Randall Tarly. He's leading us into it, skirmishing and raiding to keep his exact numbers hidden while simultaneously letting our men suffer in this rain. He wants us to follow him to his field of choice. It is obvious once you look, agreed John Connington. Once leaving Riverrun they have marched relatively north into friendly lands, not south or west or to King's Landing to hassle our own holdings. They want us to follow. I don't like the idea of playing to our enemy's advantage. Aelor replied with a nod at Tarly and Connington's words, but we have limited choice. He has time that we don't. The longer he defies the Targaryen dynasty, the stronger he looks, while we at the same time seem weaker. He still has to fight us, pointed out Oberyn, having been remarkably quiet up to that point. Ellaria was once again seated on his lap, keeping the still bitter Prince of Dorne calm. Aelor had grown more and more thankful for her since the beginning of the march. Oberyn hadn't spoke of killing Rhaegar more than 4 or 5 times since they'd left King's Landing, a much lower number than Aelor had expected. However weak you may look by not quelling his rebellion, the point remains that you have a nearly equal number of men in the field. Baratheon can prance around and call himself Emperor of the World if he wishes, but no one will call him king while a Targaryen still lives. Prince Oberyn has a valid point, agreed Sir Kevan. Oberyn wrinkled his nose in disgust at the Lannisters' support, unable to forget what the man's elder brother had intended for his sister and niece and nephew, but remained silent. Your Grace has the provisions of the Reach at your disposal. While I'm sure we all want this war to end swiftly, Baratheon cannot stay afield as long as we can. He will have to march and meet us eventually. Aelor shook his head. No, while your counsel is solid, my lords. We must press down on Baratheon and Stark. They betrayed their king, and however justified that may seem to be in their minds, we must destroy this rebellion lest more arise. Rhaegar finally spoke again. Aelor is right, we must be aggressive. The king looked from one set of eyes to another as he posed his next question. Since Baratheon is leading us to his preferred field of battle, that leaves only one question. Where is that? The lords sat back, mulling the options in their minds. It can't be a castle. They have too many forces to fit in any keep save for here in Harrenhal. Aelor drummed his fingers on the table from the chair where he faced the king. It will need be a large area, agreed Ricker. Nearly 80,000 men are going to go to war there. Prince Oberyn was stroking Ellaria's side, the upstroke of his hand lifting her decidedly Dornish garment enough to reveal an expanse of her coppery side. In truth, it wasn't much. Just a still modest glimpse, but it caused odd stirrings in Aelor's stomach and groin. Bloody hell, has it been that long? The Seven must be proud, but my body certainly isn't. The trident. The other lords turned to look at the Dornishman, the king raising an eyebrow. A river is a natural defense. Baratheon will want us to be forced to cross it, where his own men can slaughter us as we wade out of the water. That makes sense, your grace, Barristan agreed. The trident only has a handful of crossings at any point along its 3 forks. They more than likely wish to dig in on one of them, making us cross under fire from archers and fight up the opposite bank. Aelor shook his head. Baratheon never struck me as this patient. He's not, said Connington, a man who, as a former vassal of the Stormlord, would know his personality relatively well, even if he had spent the vast majority of his time with Rhaegar. He's hot-tempered and a man of action, not waiting. Arryn and Stark are tempering him. King Rhaegar approved with a nod. Baratheon would have assaulted King's Landing with all of our army inside if it weren't for those two to keep him level-headed. Harroway is unlikely, the crossing even less so. Tarly, always focused on the task at hand, was studying the map of Westeros spread across the table. We are too close to Harroway, and the crossing is too far away. Aelor had stood, walking behind his fellow members of the War Council even as he kept his eyes glued on the pieces of parchments. While we aren't sure exactly where, Baratheon is close, though I agree that he isn't likely at Harroway. His choice has a good chance of being in this area somewhere near. Here, pointed out Ricker, reaching his long arm across the wide table to circle his finger around a spot just north of where the trident split into its 3 forks. There is a crossing on one of these forks, a wide ford that is used more by small folk, though I can't recall which of these cursed rivers it is located on. The Green Fork, the king said quietly. It is on the Green Fork. Aelor looked at his brother, the Rhaegar's face haven taken on a look of finality as he looked at the map. It's unnamed but well known. The king's voice seemed resigned, as if something had just settled in his heart. As if Rhaegar had just found the answer to a question only he knew. That ford is where we will find Robert Baratheon. As soon as the others left the tower, Aelor was speaking. I just preached a bad strategy to some of the finest military minds in the 7 kingdoms. You had best explain to me why. Rhaegar still had an air of finality around him, even as he looked at his younger brother. I'm surprised you actually did it. Aelor shrugged, violet eyes glaring into his brother's identical ones. So am I. I still want to throttle you for starting this buggering war, yet I just proposed charging headlong into a trap to men who know its folly, all because you asked me to follow your lead in the War Council. Aelor snorted and shook his head. Why are we rushing into battle, Rhaegar? Because I am going to die, Aelor. The king said it calmly, as if he were merely pointing out an obvious detail. I will not survive this war. Aelor could only blink rapidly, his glare turning into a blank stare that the king returned with a sad expression. I will die at that ford. I don't know how, rather it will be from an arrow or sword, I couldn't say, but die I shall. Then why the buggering hell are we going there? Aelor, for the first time since the tourney outside the very ruin of a castle they now sat in, could look at his brother and not feel the desire to feed him his own teeth. How in the name of the 7 do you know that? I saw it in a vision. Aelor's glare returned in an instant. You bloody idiot. You start a war that's killed thousands because of a prophecy, and now you're going to march thousands more into a trap because of a vision? Yes, the king replied simply. I started this war because of a prophecy, and I'm marching into a trap because I saw it in a vision. Aegon is the prince that was promised. Fuck your prophecy, Rhaegar. Aelor said, keeping his voice remarkably composed despite the rage that was coursing through his veins. I've yelled at him about this enough. Since that won't penetrate his thick skull, maybe calm reasoning will. It was particularly hard for Aelor, though. He'd always been shit at calm reasoning. Seething in rage and killing things were his preference. Believe what you will, Aelor. Rhaegar's face was set, sad but firm in that infuriating way only Rhaegar could manage. Whether you believe the prophecy or not doesn't matter. You are my brother, and you are respected greatly by the men camped outside. I find it likely most of them love you more than they do me, but I am the king. It is my decision whether we march for the Green Fork or not. I only asked your cooperation for appearance's sake. Father was a king that did whatever he wanted because was a king, brother. Aelor said, lip curling. He ordered a city of thousands upon thousands burned to the ground. Don't tell me you are no better. For the first time since they were young children, Aelor saw rage flash across his brother's face. The king pointed a long finger towards the dragon of Duskendale, voice no longer the soft tone he so often used, having been replaced with a timbre as hard as Valyrian steel. Never compare me to Ares, Aelor. Hate me all you like, but I care for Westeros far more than either he or you ever could. All I do for the future of the 7 kingdoms. No one, not Robert fucking Baratheon or the Dragon of Duskendale, will stop me from doing what must be done. The future of Westeros, eh? What about your family? What about your son? Rhaegar lowered his finger, though his expression remained the same. My son is the future of Westeros, and my family. They are all one and the same. The king took a long drink from his wine, lowering the chalice to reveal he was once more composed, sad expression again across his countenance. My death is necessary for the ascension of my son. He will be a greater king than even Aegon the Conqueror. Aelor sat back in his chair, shocked at all he was hearing. Your son is an infant. That makes no difference. He will be a great man and a great king, and a fatherless child. Rhaegar shook his head. Nonsense, you will be a better father to him than I could. You already are. Rhaegar chuckled once at his brother's expression, a soft sound. Don't look so shocked, Aelor. You love my children as if they are your own. It's an admirable quality, particularly for a member of our family. History certainly has a lack of loving Targaryen family members and a plethora of murderous ones. I apparently also love your wife. Rhaegar smiled ever so gently. You know you do. You make it sound as if I want everything you have. You've always wanted what I have, baby brother, all except my inheritance and my winged helm. Aelor shook his head. An ugly thing, I can't fathom what you see in it. Aelor was trying to digest all Rhaegar was saying, and failing miserably. Aegon is a baby Rhaegar. Even if he will be the king you foresee him as, he will be a child king for years. The history of the Seven Kingdoms has not treated those well. Rhaegar raised an eyebrow. And who are the claimants to contest him? Viserys, a child as well, and our mother would not allow him to cause strife. Our unborn youngest sibling, another baby, this one born after succession, has occurred twice. You know, Aelor, it wouldn't matter how much you could want the crown. You adore Aegon too much to even think harm upon him. The idea of power makes a man do unthinkable things, Rhaegar. Not you, the king said. We both know it. You've never been able to lie to me, baby brother. You can't hope to start now. Aelor held his tongue, unable to counter his brother's points. It was beyond infuriating, Rhaegar thinking he knew his brother better than even his brother did. It was doubly maddening when it turned out he was right. Whatever your thoughts on your visions or your prophecies, Rhaegar, Aelor ground out, changing back to the most vital subject. I'm not going to stand by while you march our men into a trap, especially if you believe this trap will lead to your death. If you're dead set on dying, at least have the courtesy to not bring the rest of us down with you. Rhaegar stood, walking to the window of the tower to look out over the driving downpour outside. The sound of the rain on steel, canvas and stone was a constant backdrop to all that was said, a sound Aelor normally found peaceful but after the last few weeks found it as more of an annoyance. Of course, everything is an annoyance nowadays. We will win, Aelor, rather you will. The Lord of Duskendale rolled his eyes in annoyance. Let me guess you've foreseen that too. No, I haven't, but I know you will. It only makes sense, everything else has fallen into place. The Seven gave me the vision when they did because it is necessary to the completion of the prophecy. A defeat would be detrimental that. You know how much stock I put in your prophecies, Rhaegar. If I'm going to march into a slaughter, I need more than decades-old ramblings in your dreams. We will not lose. All is in place, brother. Rhaegar sounded so utterly confident, so unwavering and adamant about what he was saying that Aelor almost found himself believing it. The king was silent a moment, staring out the window. Lyanna is pregnant. Whatever small amount of understanding Aelor may have begun to garner, whatever peace he had started to make with Rhaegar, disappeared in an instant. Aelor's chair screeched in protest before clattering to the ground as he nearly flew to his feet, reminding the dragon of Duskendale of his reunion with his brother in King's Landing. It seemed years ago, though it was in truth only a few weeks. Pregnant, the Stark girl, you still have her. Rhaegar didn't even bother to turn. Of course I still have her. Where? Dorne in the Tower of Joy. The rest of my Kingsguard are with her. I request you give her a safe home in the capital after all of this is over. Aelor stomped to his brother, grabbing Rhaegar by the shoulder and whirling him around, placing his face mere inches from the king's. To hell with calm reasoning. You fucking fool. You kidnapped the girl and have the black-heartedness to. I did not kidnap her, Rhaegar interrupted calmly, keeping his voice level while his brother raged. Lyanna came with me and she has provided me with one of the key parts of the prophecy, a Vaisnya. Aelor couldn't keep the horror off of his face. You don't mean? Rhaegar shrugged loose of his brother's shocked grasp. Aegon I had a Rhaenys and Vaisnya, now so will Aegon VI. Aelor stumbled back against the wall. You can't mean this, Rhaegar. You saw what our family's marriage customs have led to. Men like Meager the cruel, Aryan Brightflame, Ares the mad. It must stop. You can't mean for your own son and daughter. I can and I do. Rhaegar returned to his seat. Aegon will marry his sisters and he will be the prince that is promised. That is my will. Rhaegar waved his hand as he took another sip of wine. So calm and collected that you wouldn't think he just predicted his death and ordered what was to happen years afterwards. I will not hear your complaints on the matter, Aelor. We march for the Green Fork with or without you. We both know it will be with. Now go, there is much to prepare. Though he had thought about it many times in anger, for the first time in his life Aelor Targaryen seriously considered killing his brother. This is madness. He is no saner than our father. Aelor's hand started drifting down his side to the emerald dagger resting in his belt. Our dynasty cannot survive another mad king, no matter how brief a reign it is foreseen to be. Before Aelor was fully aware of what he was doing, his hand had taken the dagger's hilt, his arm, as if it had a mind of its own, unsheathing it halfway. Rhaegar was no longer paying any attention to the prince, reading the parchments in front of him as if the dragon of Duskendale was 5 miles away instead of 5 feet. Barristan had left with the others on Rhaegar's orders. And Aelor was alone with the king. It would be so easy to walk over and slit his throat, to end this folly that could only end in catastrophic loss of life before it could progress to something so much worse than it already was. It would be the best course of action for the 7 kingdoms, for Aegon, for Aelia. Aelor pulled the dagger the rest of the way free, still unnoticed by his brother. I'll be hated, but I can live with that hate if it saves so many lives, can't I? Killing was nothing new. He was experienced at it, he was skilled at it, he enjoyed it. He could take this last life to save so many others, couldn't he? In the end, it turned out he couldn't. Aelor fled from the room, carried off without conscious thought, right hand full of bared steel. His mind raced even as his feet did the same, vaulting down the stairs, dagger frozen at the ready by his side. The dragon of Duskendale stumbled out of the tower into the driving rain, paying no attention to the water soaking his silver hair and stinging his skin. I nearly killed my own brother. I nearly cut his throat. Aelor hit his knees, his hand instinctually going out in front of him to stop him from falling on his face amidst the mud and shit. While it succeeded in that, it also succeeded in biting into his other forearm, causing the prince to roar out in pain as red blood mixed with colorless water to pour down his arm into the brown and black filth below. Aelor stayed there for some time, hearing the shouts of men as they rushed to his side, the squelch of mud and slosh of puddled water filling his ears as they neared. He paid them no mind, head and eyes downcast as his silver hair clung to his forehead. I nearly killed my brother, a great pain not of the physical nature that he could handle, but of the much more scarring internal kind ripped through his numbed body as another thought hit him. I should have killed my brother. Of all the lives I have taken, I didn't have the guts to take the one that needed taking most. I'm a craven who has condemned us all to a bloody death. Aelor lifted his head, letting the droplets of rain pound against his face and eyes as he stared into the sky, channeling his despair and pain into a glare at the gray and black overhead. His men were huddled around him, their questions and concerns buzzing like an incessant fly in the dragon of Duskendale's ears, the feel of their hands on his shoulders and arms no more relevant than the piss he'd taken that morning. There is a second mad king on the throne, and I'm as powerless against this one as I was the first. Aelor Targaryen had never been more ashamed of himself in his life. Fatherhood was already fraying his nerves, and his child hadn't even been born yet. Eddard Stark wasn't supposed to be here, leading thousands of Northmen in a war against a dynasty that had been in power for 3 centuries. He wasn't supposed to be the Lord Paramount of the North, reigning over the largest region of Westeros. That was supposed to be his father. He wasn't supposed to be married to Catelyn Tully with an heir to the north on the way either. That was supposed to be his brother. No, Eddard Stark was supposed to be at Winterfell, serving his father and in time his brother as they ruled, maybe holding a small keep of his own in the distant future. But Rickard and Brandon Stark were dead at the hands of Aerys Targaryen, and Catelyn Tully was at Riverrun heavy with his child. A quick wedding to a woman he didn't know. An awkward wedding night, and then he'd left, returning weeks later with his his bannerman to find his wife pregnant. He'd spent a few weeks there as well, Jon Arryn and Hoster Tully forming their own men as Robert Baratheon evaded the men of the Reach and Aelor Targaryen to slip out of the Stormlands and merge with them. Brandon would have handled the whole ordeal excellently, Eddard knew. He'd know just what to say to a young wife he was unfamiliar with. Know how to make her laugh and feel comfortable with him. Eddard had not a single clue how to even begin that, and it showed in the awkward conversations, or lack thereof, he and his lady wife attempted to have. But Brandon was dead, courtesy of the Targaryens, and Eddard was in over his head. But the overwhelming sense of protectiveness he felt when he felt the babe she was carrying turned Eddard Stark into a different man. It fascinated him, knowing he'd had a part in creating the tiny life that his wife said thoroughly enjoyed keeping her up all night with his kicks. Even now, miles away, it was very nearly all the Northmen could think about. Worry continuously nagged at him, fear that something would go wrong with the birth or that the child wouldn't even make it that long, nearly driving him to a panic, and Eddard Stark did not panic. It shocked him how much he already cared for his son or daughter. Eddard would fight for that child, still unknown to him, until his dying breath. A breath that might occur much sooner than he'd like, judging by the way things were going. Tywin Lannister is still a prisoner in King's Landing, Jon Arryn was saying, the rain riddling the canvas the War Council sat under relentlessly. Eddard found himself missing not only Winterfell but Riverrun and his stranger of a wife. At least she was warm. But his brother Sir Kevan is leading the remaining Westermen with the Loyalist army. It puts their numbers roughly even with our own, maybe a few thousand less. With a good number being veterans, Bronze Yohn Royce put in, bronze armor resplendent even if rather impractical. Certainly more than we have. Veterans of what, a few slaughters? Great John Umber put in with a short laugh of derision. The giant man with a giant as a sigil had given Eddard a fair amount of trouble when he'd first rallied the banners, but in the recent weeks had seemed to take a shine to the young Lord of the North. He was boisterously loud, but he also had a streak of undying loyalty Eddard hoped he could earn. They haven't seen true war. Maybe not, agreed burly Hoster Tully. Eddard knew good father, but they've seen more war than our men. My lads have seen war, chimed in Robert's booming voice, sitting at the head of the table with a horn of ale in his big right hand. It was his third of the meeting, and Ned knew his friend was only beginning. We routed 3 armies in 3 battles in 1 day. We know, John agreed, keeping his tone calm, though Eddard knew the man he saw as a second father was as tired as the rest of them of hearing about the only true rebel victories of the war. Each of those were small skirmishes, even smaller than some of the second Targaryen sons. Eddard spoke before Robert could, noticing his friend's scowl. Robert was quick to anger and quicker to forgive, especially Jon Arryn, but he absolutely hated everything to do with a Targaryen ever since the new king of the Iron Throne had ran off with Eddard's sister. I'll find you, Lyanna, I promise. They are camped at Harrenhal, but spies indicate they intend to march for us. We should reach the ford before they do. Afterwards, we can only hope they decide to attack us there instead of taking another crossing. They'll hit us there, Robert said, confidently, his brush of anger already forgotten. They want us dead, we want them dead, and that ford is in between us. That river will run red with those Targaryen cunts' blood. Eddard caught the glance Jon Arryn gave him. Robert's obsession with killing the Targaryen brothers was growing more and more manic with every passing day. Wanting Rhaegar's head was something Eddard could understand. He only need think of his sister's face to feel the same anger Robert seemed to live on. But Robert's rage seemed to extend to every living being with close Targaryen ties. More than once he had ranted to Eddard about his desire to kill not only the king but his brother, the reported new hand of the king. While Aelor was by no means innocent, Eddard personally thought him to be a decent man. He had been friendly and sociable at the tourney of Harrenhal, and when Rhaegar had crowned Lyanna instead of Elia Mardell the Queen of Love and Beauty, no man had been more outraged. The dragon of Duskendale's rage had even trumped Brandon's. Aerys and Rhaegar were the true men at fault, yet that mattered not at all to Robert. Eddard feared just how far his old friend would go. The rest of the council was procedure. Reports of the growing number of sick men, and reiterating the same strategy they had decided upon weeks ago, all amongst Robert's more and more drunken spouts of anger directed at anything Targaryen. Daenerys Arryn, Jon's kinsman and heir after Aerys executed Elbert Arryn soon after Brandon, made the mistake of complimenting the dragon of Duskendale's skill at arms. Only Eddard's firm grip on his strong arm and Jon's calm chiding keeping Robert from rising from his seat in rage, the big storm lord resorting to drinking more and more ale and wine. As soon as they were dismissed, Ned stepped out into the rain, small Howland Reed materializing out of nowhere to walk beside him, the tiny Cranogman having been Eddard's constant companion since Lyanna's abduction. The Lord of the Neck had instantly grown enamored with Lyanna, in the way only Eddard's sister could ensnare people, and though Howland was as calm and somber as any man Ned Stark could ever remember meeting, it was clear that he was as concerned with Lyanna's safety as maybe even Stark himself. Robert grows more and more impatient. Eddard nodded, the rain pelting his face and furs as he made his way towards where his Northmen were camped. Each day his anger increases. A man who speaks loudly and often rarely says anything of value. The Lord Paramount of the North chuckled lightly, a true statement he fears for Lyanna, as do I. The Cranogman was quiet for a moment. We will find her, my lord, we will. I certainly hope so, Eddard Stark said. I most certainly hope so. Have you ever loved something more than life itself? Aelor Targaryen looked up from horn of ale he held in his hand, wondering if he had misheard his friend's deep voice through the sound of the rain pelting the roof overhead. The prince's silvery hair was still damp, and the gash on his shield arm was bound tightly with bandages, aching almost in unison with the still healing gash over his eye. Aelor supposed it didn't help that he kept reopening the injury, but it was hard to take things easy in a war, especially when it's being orchestrated by a madman. Say again, Aelor asked Renfred Ricker, the big man sitting on the other side of the room having pulled him from the mud in his stupor earlier, stubbornly refusing to leave the prince in afterwards. Aelor was glad for his lifelong friend's interference though. He knew it had shaken the men to see their normally competent prince so disconcerted. Renfred had hustled him off to his chambers in the barracks hall, smoothing the situation over expertly, before sending Alaric for a maester to bind the dragon of Duskendale's arm. He'd warded off the well-meaning but unneeded men asking about their prince's condition, allowing only Alaric and Prince Oberyn to enter and remain in the room. The four men, well, 3.5, sat in the candlelight, quietly nursing horns of ale or chalices of wine. Renfred looked up, smiling lightly. I asked if you have ever loved something more than life itself. My daughters, Oberyn said. The Red Viper sprawled back in a chair as if it were his chambers they were gathered in and not Aelor's. Of course, Aelor imagined if they were in Oberyn's tent the surroundings would be much different, as Aelor had a stunning lack of potion and naked bodies, something Oberyn always seemed to have in great supply. The dragon of Duskendale's own temporary quarters were sparse, a cot and his armor the only embellishments besides a few chairs Alaric had rounded up from somewhere. The lad was quite resourceful when it came to scavenging. Aelor snorted, the ones you know about anyway. The Dornishman glared good-naturedly, forging ahead. A man knows his children when he sees them. I certainly knew mine and I loved them from that moment on. How sweet, Aelor chimed in, ribbing his friend in an attempt to take his mind off of his brother's madness. One would never know you were able to kill a man with a needle prick. A fact you had best remember, my friend, the Red Viper said with smirk, taking a drink from the chalice he held. Dahlia Bywater, Alaric chimed in quietly, instantly blushing heavily when Aelor choked on the ale he had been drinking. Whoa now, the prince said between coughs, you've never mentioned her. No, the squire said with the tiniest of smiles, but I've thought of her plenty. Renfred and Oberyn laughed, both raising their glasses to the boy in salute. Aelor held his tongue on all the questions he had, chief among them who Dahlia Bywater was, but the prince had held his tongue. Alaric was being more and more outspoken as of late, and the prince saw no need to push him. Instead, he turned back to Renfred. Why do you ask, Ren? Mélissa is pregnant. Congratulations, my friend, Oberyn said with a smile that Alaric echoed, raising their glasses again in another salute. Aelor, however, stared at his friend as if he'd grown two heads. How did that come about? Oberyn laughed. If you don't know that, my Targaryen warrior, I know plenty of people who would gladly show you. The Dornishman purposefully left plenty unsaid just to annoy the dragon of Duskendale. Alaric ducking his head in embarrassment even as Aelor gave the prince a universally known hand gesture telling him exactly where he could go with his remarks. I mean, you haven't seen Mélissa since we marched for King's Landing from Duskendale. I'm fairly certain you would need to have been there more recently for this to be a recent occurrence. It's not a recent occurrence, Renfred said, shrugging. You were right about the chance of a wedding night giving me an heir. It appears it has. I have kept it quiet for fear of things going wrong, but she wrote me from King's Landing saying she may give birth any day now. Her father is abusing his position as regent of the city to give her everything humanly possible to keep her comfortable. Aelor smiled widely, joy for his friend momentarily overruling his depression at his brother's loss of reasonable judgment. Strong shield, Ren, I'm happy for you. Stronger sword, I love that child more than life itself already, and I haven't even spoken more than a dozen words to his or her mother. I never thought I could be a father. But now I can't remember wanting anything more. The Dragonlord took a breath to say something in reply, but Renfred cut him off, leaning forward to peer at his lifelong friend intently. I mentioned it now because that child is something I would fight to my dying breath for despite it not having even been born yet. That child gives me hope, gives me something to not only fight for but live for. Aelor looked away, thoughts of Rhaegar's proclamations and plans for the future running through his head. But Renfred didn't let his mind stray. Look at me, Aelor. Whatever the king said that disconcerted you so doesn't matter. Whatever his reasons for marching us into a trap and whatever your reasons for agreeing to it do not matter. Think of Aegon, think of Rhaenys, think of Aelia. Whatever the king thinks is going to happen, whatever he has planned can be handled because you have them, and they are worth whatever sacrifice we make. The Dragon Prince blinked, unused to Renfred having this much to say about anything, but it seemed the Lord of Hollard Hall wasn't finished. Every man here has something to fight for. Oberyn has his daughters, all 24 of them. The Red Viper snorted at the big man's exaggeration but was watching the two men intently, clearly agreeing with what Renfred was saying. Alaric has this Dahlia Bywater, whoever the lucky lass is. I have Mélissa and my unborn child. And you have your family, children you think of as your own no matter their true paternity. Children we both know you would die for just as quickly as I would die for mine. Renfred leaned back, voice completely confident. Whatever the king has to say doesn't matter to me, Aelor. Whatever has you so upset doesn't make a difference because this world is going to be fine. No matter the king's plans or lack thereof, the world will be just fine. We could all die tomorrow. Something more likely than not, and the world will be fine. Those very things we are fighting for will see to that. The Lord of Hollard Hall suddenly shoved the prince none too lightly in his shoulder, knocking the Targaryen prince backwards. So snap yourself out of whatever shithole you've got in your mind into my lord. We have a war to win, not for us but for them. Aelor stared at his lifelong friend for a long while before holding his hand out. Thank you, Ren. Ricker grabbed his forearm, Aelor closing his hand around Ricker's own. Don't thank me, Aelor. Win the war for me, win it for them. Aelor nodded. Bugger Rhaegar, bugger the prophecy, bugger Robert fucking Baratheon. I have a prince and princess to protect. For the first time in a long while, Aelor remembered just what he was warring for, Aaliyah's face filling his mind's eyes and Rhaenys' laugh so real in his ears he could have sworn she was next to him. And suddenly, things didn't seem all that bad. No, things didn't seem all that bad at all. The capital had certainly changed in the time she'd been gone. Flea Bottom was mostly gone, half of the once densely populated section of King's Landing nothing more than charred buildings and blackened streets. The smell of smoke and, more disturbingly, burned flesh still clung to the area like a fog. Of destruction? Bones, some being pulled from the rubble and others from a massive funeral pyre, were still being disposed of by teams of hard-hearted men, more than Aelia Martell could count. The city, even, this long after the Lannister attack, was disturbingly quiet for King's Landing, the normal hustle and bustle while still present much subdued. "My queen," came the soft but firm voice of the man in white armor beside her. "I don't like the idea of you being here." Aelia turned to face Arthur Dayne of the Kingsguard, Sword of the Morning. His sudden appearance at Dragonstone had thrown the Princess of Dorne for quite a loop, as did her old friend's insistence that she board the sleek, fast longboats out of his ancestral seat of Starfall. Sir Manfred had barked half of the Royal Navy into action before the shooting star of Dane was sighted on the sail of the sleek ships the Danes used to navigate the Torrentine River. And even then he had ordered the galleys to the ready. Despite the mere 10 small ships approaching Dragonstone's 80 warships, Sir Arthur had greeted her at the gates of the Dragonmont, the greatsword Dawn, said to have been forged from a fallen star by Arthur's long-dead ancestors, strapped across his back. For a fleeting moment upon seeing the silver hair of her handmaiden's brother Aelia had believed Rhaegar had returned, but the white armor that immediately followed the silver locks into her vision put rest to that notion immediately. Ashara had nearly leapt into her brother's arms, the two almost unfairly attractive siblings having always been close, but Aelia had hesitated. Arthur was Rhaegar's closest friend and confidant, having disappeared along with her husband shortly before the Stark girl had disappeared. It didn't take a genius to connect the dots between those two occurrences. Aelia had known Arthur had played a hand in Lyanna's disappearance for quite some time, and whatever their previous friendship, she hadn't been able to forget that. In truth, she wasn't sure she wanted to. Apparently, Sir Manfred hadn't been able to forget it either. He had seemed to take a personal slight against Arthur Dayne on Aelia's behalf. While the newest knight of the Kingsguard gave very few damns about very few things, he did seem to like the Princess of Dorne he had been ordered to protect. And to Manfred, that seemed to mean giving the man who had played a part in her husband's folly absolute hell. "I don't like the idea of a fucking knight giving the queen orders," came the rough voice of Sir Manfred, glaring openly at the taller and much more handsome Dornishman. It was one thing that she agreed to return to King's Landing, despite Aelor's letter saying to stay on the island. It's another for you to buggering order her around once she's here. The king's orders overrule the hands, sir, the normally calm and subdued Dane nearly spat out. Having dealt with Manfred's nearly constant verbal barrage practically since he'd stepped off of the longboats at Dragonstone, a petty part of Aelia found it highly amusing. "The king ordered me to escort the queen and her children back to King's Landing. They were safer at Dragonstone. That is not your decision to make, Sir Manfred. You are a Kingsguard, you serve the king." Manfred snorted. "I serve the royal family, all of them. From the babe to the dowager queen, you let the mad king rape." Arthur whirled on Manfred, violet eyes like his sister's, like Aelor's, like Rhaegar's, blazing in fury. "I follow the king's orders, as will you. My duty is to protect and serve the king unquestioningly, something I have always done. It is now your duty as well." Manfred's scowl was only deepening. "My buggering duty is to protect the entire fucking family, something I've been doing while you've been hiding who the fuck knows where with a girl you helped steal." The rage on Arthur Dayne's attractive face prompted Aelia to finally put a stop to the bickering. "Peace, sirs, you are brothers in arms now, no matter your thoughts on the matter." Arthur grudgingly turned to face her again, Manfred giving a snort of derision and contempt that had Aelia barely concealing her smile. "As for your concerns, Arthur, this is my city as much as the king's. These people were mine as much as his. These people are dead," Manfred said bluntly. Manfred says everything bluntly. Nothing can change that. "You should address the queen as your grace," Arthur put in, clearly having lost all patience with the vulgar but loyal boulder of a man. "You should bugger the fuck off." "I said peace, Manfred," Aelia cut in. Whatever your thoughts on Arthur or his on you, he is as concerned for my safety as you are. Elia sighed, and he is partially correct. It is time to return to the keep. As they rode, her Kingsguard knights flanking her and a retinue of 20 men-at-arms spread behind them. Elia couldn't help but see the pain, weariness and oftentimes anger on the faces of the small folk as they watched the Targaryen banner floating in the air. Damage from the battle was still visible all around, from partially burnt buildings to the hard glint in the eyes of children who had seen too much too early. Elia felt a pressure building in her throat and sinuses, fighting off tears as she saw a boy no older than Viserys with a barely healing cut from a blade across his tiny face. The image of his young, ancient appearance stayed in her mind until long after they had dismounted in the Red Keep. Sir Manfred and Sir Arthur followed her shoulder to shoulder throughout the halls of the keep. The hallway was barely wide enough to hold the massive expanse of Manfred's dark shoulders on his own, much less beside another armored individual, but neither man would stand for letting the other follow the queen any closer than they themselves were. When the trio neared the queen's chambers, Elia drew to a stop and faced them, both standing a bit straighter under her scrutiny. Sir Manfred, I have to ask you to watch over Aegon for now. Sir Arthur and I have much to discuss. The big man's scowl deepened, but he turned to obey. Don't worry, Manfred, the queen called after him. You're still my favorite. Elia knew by the flash of apprehension that crossed Arthur's face that the Knight of the Kingsguard was fully aware that this wasn't going to be a pleasant conversation for him. To his credit, he attempted to lighten the mood as soon as they had entered the queen's chambers, Elia striding to take a chair in her solar as he spoke while doing her best not to stare at the section of floor where she had been informed the butchered bodies of Tanara Vaith and John Arthur Derry had lain. I don't see how you can tolerate, much less like that brute of a knight. Elia took a seat, smoothing her dress as she sank into the cushioned chair before turning her gaze on Arthur. She didn't offer the Knight of the Kingsguard the chance to sit down, something that clearly wasn't lost on the Sword of the Morning. That brute of a knight would give his life for me without a moment's hesitation. For me, not just the king. Manfred would die for me or Aelor, for Aegon or Rhaenys, for Rhaella or Viserys, and he doesn't even like Viserys. The man's loyalty is to the royal family, not just its head, to a bloodline, not one man. Arthur looked to the ground with a sigh, clasping his hands behind his back as he prepared for the berating that was sure to come. I know you are hurt, Elia. I do not blame you for being so. Elia waited a heartbeat for him to continue, but the Sword of the Morning's mouth remained closed, prompting a scoffing laugh to escape the Princess of Dorne's throat. That's it. I suppose it's more than I got from your closest companion, His Grace Rhaegar Targaryen. Arthur said nothing in his king's defense, which suited Elia just fine considering she had plenty more to say on her own. I know we were never in love, but our marriage was a happy one. Why did he throw it away? Why did he throw it away without at least a word of warning to his wife, or at least a bloody letter? Arthur did open his mouth to reply this time, but Elia waved him away, knowing that nothing the Sword of the Morning could say would make much difference. He wasn't Rhaegar. Any excuses he had for the King of the Iron Throne, however reasonable they might be, though Elia doubted any answer could be reasonable in this situation, wouldn't matter to her. Never mind, you are sworn to secrecy or honor-bound to silence or some other chivalric excuse men use to lie to women. You are not Rhaegar, and you are not responsible for his actions, you are responsible for your own. Elia let her rising anger bleed into her glare. And since you are responsible for your actions, you will answer this question honestly. Arthur looked up to meet her gaze, raising an eyebrow. Did the Stark girl come willingly? The Sword of the Morning's lips quirked up in the lightest of smiles. Of all the things you could ask, that is your question. Concern for Lyanna? I wouldn't call it concern, Elia responded coldly, although it certainly could be called concern. It was one thing if Lyanna Stark had willingly eloped with Elia's husband. If Rhaegar had taken her against her will, a thought that would at one time have been inconceivable of her husband, but in light of recent events seemed damn near likely, it was a completely different issue. Considerate curiosity as to whether I should be furious at both the king and the girl or just one of them. Arthur shook his head ever so slightly. Do you really think Rhaegar capable of such an atrocity? Do you truly believe me capable of aiding him in it? Elia held his gaze. I don't know what to think anymore, Arthur, now answer me. The Sword of the Morning stared for a moment longer before looking away with another sigh. Yes, Lyanna came willingly, we did not abduct her as the Starks claimed. Half of the Starks are dead now thanks to the chain of events you and my husband set off. Arthur grimaced, his gaze dropping to the ground again. At least he has the good graces to be ashamed of some of the things he has helped in. That is much more than Rhaegar ever offered. The knowledge that Rhaegar wasn't holding Lyanna Stark captive, lifted a weight the size of the 7 kingdoms off of Aaliyah's shoulders. While the hurt and anger was still very much there and in likelihood would be for the rest of her life, at least Rhaegar hadn't stooped so low as to hold an innocent young girl against her will. Whatever his reasons for the sudden betrayal, at least he hadn't taken complete leave of his once good character. The thought of Rhaegar's shadowy motives brought up a whole other question, one Aaliyah hadn't asked yet due to Sir Manfred's nearly constant company. While she was very thankful for and touched by the short giant's protectiveness, his presence tended to make Arthur keep answers and explanations to himself for the sake of the king he served. "Why are we really back in King's Landing, Arthur? The king commanded it." Aaliyah scoffed again. "Yes, I realize Rhaegar commanded it. I'm asking why. And maybe more pressing to my mind, I'm asking why he commanded it while letting Aelor believe we were to remain at Dragonstone." Arthur still hadn't looked at her again. "How do you know Aelor isn't aware of the king's plans?" "Because Aelor wrote me saying we were to remain at Dragonstone for the remainder of the war. And then, lo and behold, you show up a few days later with another letter, nay, a mere note. One that wasn't even addressed to me. From Rhaegar ordering my children and I to the capital. Aelor doesn't keep secrets from me, and since he didn't mention returning to King's Landing in his first letter after the attack or the one since, it means he doesn't know." Arthur raised an eyebrow knowingly as he finally met her eyes again. "You still keep a close correspondence with your husband's brother, I see." Aaliyah's response had quite a bit more bite to it than normal. Mainly thanks to the odd way Arthur's offhand comment made her stomach flutter. "Do not change the subject, Arthur Dane." The Sword of the Morning shrugged nonchalantly, though his face flashed no small amount of uncertainty. "I don't know." "What do you mean you don't know?" "I mean I don't know. I don't know how the king knew where you would be. I don't know why he was so adamant that I return you here, and I don't know why he's keeping Aelor in the dark about it all. Rhaegar refused to give me a reason either. He just abruptly ordered me to take longboats and escort you to King's Landing from Dragonstone." Aaliyah furrowed her brow in confusion. "Were you already at Starfall? Is that where you're holding the Stark girl?" Arthur's disconcerted expression increased. "No, she's in Dorne, true enough, but not near my childhood home. It would have taken you weeks to sail from the Elbow to Dragonstone." Aaliyah's confusion and discomfort grew as another comment of Arthur's sank in. "Wait a minute. If Rhaegar was still with you, if he gave you the orders himself, how did he know we would be? It was Aelor, not the king, who arranged our evacuation in case the city were attacked, he and Varys and Sir Manfred. How did Rhaegar have any idea?" Arthur's eyes, normally so completely confident in himself and trusting in Rhaegar Targaryen, held the same confusion and disquiet that Aaliyah knew was reflected in her own. "I don't know, Aaliyah. I was sailing from Dorne when the attack on King's Landing even transpired. Truth be told, I was as shocked to find you on Dragonstone as you were to find me." Aaliyah slumped back into her chair, a certainly unqueenly thing to do but one she felt was more than warranted at the moment. Her mind raced at this new influx of impossible information. "That makes no sense, Arthur." The Knight of the Kingsguard nodded. "I know, Your Grace, I am as disconcerted as you." Aaliyah rose to her feet suddenly. "No, Arthur, this is impossible. There is no way for Rhaegar to have known where we were or how we got there when he gave you your orders." Arthur shrugged. "But he did. You were there just as he said you would be." Arthur took a few steps towards her, leaning in and lowering his voice, although they both knew that would do no good in the Red Keep were someone motivated enough to eavesdrop on their conversation. "We both know of Rhaegar's past insights." Aaliyah matched his tone. Any lingering resentment towards the Sword of the Morning for his role in Rhaegar's adultery temporarily forgotten. "I know, but this is inconceivable. Targaryens have a history of visions, yes, but they are supposedly no more than dreams, vague images that can be interpreted 1,000 different ways. They aren't premonitions of occurrences weeks before they take place." Arthur Dane shrugged again. "We've always known Rhaegar has an otherworldly aspect to him at times, and we've always known he's rarely ever forthcoming with whatever apparitions he does receive." The Sword of the Morning leaned back, slightly violet orbs as concerned as her own black ones. "I'm not saying that was the case, Aaliyah, but nothing else makes any sense to me." Aaliyah took a long, calming breath. "Did he mention anything else? Are there any other orders?" Arthur hesitated slightly. "No. He asked me to bring you, Aegon and Rhaenys, to King's Landing. He made no mention of Queen Rhaella or Prince Viserys, which is why I was willing to let them stay on Dragonstone under the protection of your uncle and the remaining fleet." Arthur hesitated again, fighting a battle with himself that he lost in short order. "Actually, he did mention one thing. He told me to protect you. That is your duty as it is, Arthur." "No, Your Grace, he asked me to protect you. You in particular." Aaliyah felt fear blossom in the pit of her stomach, and the impossibilities of the situation coupled with Rhaegar's cryptic orders stoked it even more. "Why?" The Sword of the Morning shook his head slowly, not even attempting to mask the grave concern and worry in his violet eyes. I don't know, Your Grace, I truly don't know.